One.
Yeah.
We have all council is here, and Mr. Freeze is here, and Mr. Sanders is here, and Mr. Stroman's going to keep us legal. So I'll call this meeting to order. This will be a work session of City Council. It is not a public hearing. It is not. We're not going to have public comment. It's just an opportunity for us to talk, really for the first time that we've ever had, to talk about the zoning rewrite process. I guess call to order, roll call. We need to do a roll call, Ms. Thomas? We've noted everybody's here. Okay, good. So part of what we were trying to do in all of this was to recognize that the Planning Commission has spent a couple of years going through a lot of things that we have spent almost no time on. And to recognize that, for example, there are certain things that certain ways that the whole zoning rewrite process has changed the draft significantly over the course of the last couple of years, and really changing from the time that it was coming through the comprehensive plan and the future land use map. So in some ways, some of the basic assumptions that we thought we had going in 2 years ago, I think in many ways we've kind of drawn back from, and we have to revisit. And so I had some very broad thoughts on things that I would like to take a look at, and I sent about a 10-page memo or something like that to Mr. Freeze a couple of weeks ago. And
14
Yes.
but who's counting?
single space.
That's right.
And no pictures.
And no pictures.
And no maps.
And no maps. All I can say is a febrile imagination at 3 in the morning. So we're not going to talk about all that tonight, and we're going to get started on a few of the topics. And I'll just turn it over to you, Mr. Freeze, and
All right.
tell us where we want to go.
Great. Thank you very much. Happy to be here this evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council.
I want
yeah.
to say something before we get started. I see Mr. Mitchell is here. And I wanted to say publicly what I said to a number of folks last night after sitting through the work session and sitting in on, let me put it that way, the work session that they had going through the zoning ordinance in some detail, that they went through in some areas with great detail and great attention to detail in a way that I, for one, greatly appreciated, because it is good to know that intelligent people are looking at it so carefully, because it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable with the product, and the knowledge that we as a council will not devote the same degree of attention to paragraph by paragraph in some of these things. To know that the Planning Commission has done so with a lot of thought and contemplation. I just want to say that publicly. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. With that.
Great. Right. So tonight is the first of a 3-meeting lineup we have to talk about what we've identified as kind of background, kind of theory level issues, and give you all an opportunity to talk about those issues and ask questions of various staff or experts we have involved in the project. So I'm going to kick off tonight's. The intent of the proposed development code is, of course, to implement the comprehensive plan, and the presentation and discussion this evening will focus on how the proposed zoning addresses the community design objectives of the comprehensive plan. I'm joined this evening by Christy Dotson from Code Studio, who is with us via Zoom, and she will be presenting on the zoning aspect of the work. I'm just going to do kind of a very brief introduction.
Thank you.
One of the primary objectives of the comprehensive plan was, as we all know, addressing issues of racial equity in land use decisions. And the method of that was to be achieved through creating more opportunities for a wider range of housing choices with a range of affordability across the entire city. So as is proposed today, and as was proposed in the comprehensive plan and the land use map, we're allowing small multifamily from 3 units up to a small, up to 8 units, and townhouses to be basically built everywhere within the city, with more density near important community amenities. So where we get to the higher end of that, it's closer to amenities like schools, parks, transit, resources, with the idea that we want to promote access to these resources for everybody in the community. We've also opened opportunities for a greater range of entrepreneurial activities, so that starting a business doesn't have to mean obtaining a separate location from one's home. Now, I want to note, with this greater degree of rights and opportunities comes a greater degree of responsibility. We expect new and renovated buildings to contribute to the quality of the community, and are recommending a range of rules in the zoning ordinance that accomplish that. That's something that Christy's going to get into in much greater detail. Looking ahead, our next meeting is going to be on the issue of displacement. And the following meeting is going to look at population growth, and the housing market. So at the end of tonight's discussion, I'm hoping we can take a couple of minutes to talk about those upcoming meetings and answer any questions, but I'm also looking for some feedback on what you guys might be looking for in addition on those topics looking ahead.
Could you repeat those again for me?
Sure.
Mr. Freeze?
So the next meeting on October 3rd is on the issue of displacement and gentrification. And then the October 11th meeting is going to be on population growth and the housing market.
When are we going to be able to get into some depth on the expected rate of change?
Rate of change is included within that housing market.
Okay.
The rate of change is basically how is the housing market how might the housing market respond to the proposed zone.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So, yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions at this point. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Christy to get started.
I would be interested in just sort of a brief recap of where the Planning Commission stands.
Absolutely.
I've read this, but this was what came out in late August.
Yep.
I know you all have been continuing to do work. will we get another red line copy of this, maybe blue lined, or?
Well, look, I can speak to that. So first, I appreciate the attention you've given to it, so thank you for that. So the Planning Commission met last night to, as the mayor said, go into great detail in their review of the ordinance and identify any places where they might want to suggest a further change. So the first meeting of that was last night. They're going to meet again next week to do the same thing with the goal of by either at the next meeting or at the latest, we're hoping, by their October 10th meeting of making their formal recommendation to council with a list of changes. We are not at that time going to do a full redraft of the document. We will be, at that point, we will be in this meeting process and in a subsequent meetings. And what we imagine is that part of our conversation with the council may lead to additional changes or modifications, which we would then eventually get to a point of doing a full draft at that point in time when we're ready to advertise for a public hearing.
Understood. Will we get some sort of summary?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we're working on that right now. There will be a summary to try and make it very clear what are the changes that are being recommended by the Planning Commission.
The changes from this,
Changes from that document that you have today.
okay,
Yep,
okay.
The tweaks.
the tweaks.
Do we
Nothing
have,
too substantive, I'm assuming.
will there be a rationale from them for why it changed? If this says, I don't know, page 150 is currently this, but the Planning Commission recommends that page 150 now be this after additional consideration, they will say why, or are we to ask them that?
We certainly can provide that, yeah.
I think that would help
I'm
me.
trying to do it in a
I don't know
very-
about the other council people, but if you have something and we're reading it and we're trying to understand it, and now the people that have worked on this forever and a day
Yeah,
are saying we need to revisit this and change this before it goes to the next level. If someone could explain why they made the change, it would be easier
mhm,
for me to understand versus voting on something blindly,
absolutely.
trying to keep my heart burned down. You know, Rolaids and I are up close and personal.
Great. All right, Christie, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Great. I believe you all have a PowerPoint that you can either share on your end. If that doesn't work, I can share it. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Missy. And I'll just let you know when to move to the next slide. So thank you for having me. I'm going to try to just give you all a brief overview. You know, this meeting really is for you all's discussion. So I want to save as much time for that as possible. I essentially just want to give you some points to think about and a bit of context so that we can start to connect, as James outlined, those high-level planning goals with how that eventually makes it into each of these quite technical 400-plus page document and really how they all network together. So really just hoping to connect those policy goals with how they've ended up in the ordinance that's in front of you today. So that's the goal. I'm going to try to get through all this quickly, and hopefully it'll just give you a broad overview, and then we can have questions and discussion after that. Next slide, please. This idea of a zoning buffer, this really is going to tie into that rate of change, but I did want to highlight this white paper that's recently come out of UCLA's Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. And essentially what it describes is looking at some research on the gap between a city's population, the estimated zoning capacity, that's really what they're calling the zoning buffer, and the impacts that has on affordability in the long term. A couple of the key takeaways they had, and I encourage you all to, I'm sure James can provide a link to this, to dig into the study more. These are just high-level takeaways that when a community does modest upzoning, so that's, just incrementally here and there to keep up with population growth, it generally results in the property owners benefiting primarily from that change. And it generally makes renting and home buying more expensive. And that low zoning capacity really leads to that value capture and windfalls for existing property owners, whereas a broader community-wide approach, this study found, leads to better outcomes for housing affordability in the long term. So I think it's applicable to some of the things that you all are talking about, as well as, obviously this is something communities across the US are thinking about. So I wanted to offer that up as a resource to you all. Next slide, please. I want to touch on a couple of the goals from the comprehensive plan. The first goal being that there needs to be a new zoning ordinance that helps apply all the goals from the comprehensive plan, the affordable housing plan, small area plan, standard design manual. So that really is why we're doing this process, because your current ordinance really doesn't have the tools that you need to implement all of those goals and all of those policies that were outlined in all of the plans that you've adopted in the past several years. Another key thing that we're going to talk about, as James mentioned, this really is focusing on some of the design elements in particular. Of course, there are a lot of other really important goals that are implemented in the zoning, but I'm just going to try to focus on a couple of the design ones. And that's goal 6. And that goal talks about Charlottesville's history of architectural design excellence, maintaining traditional urban design features, valuing historic resources while encouraging creative, context-sensitive, contemporary planning and design that support the goal of the comp plan. So how are we doing that? Next slide, please. One way that we've thought about this through the whole process is this idea of human scale development. When Charlottesville was originally founded, it was founded around the scale of a human. We really didn't have cars then. And so that really is something that we've thought about through as we're thinking about district standards, use standards, any of the site and subdivision standards, and even the processes of how do we make zoning that is human scale development. And I'll talk a bit about what that means at a neighborhood scale and at a building scale, and how we're really linking up the technical aspects of the code in order to achieve that. But I think this really ties in well too with one of the strategies in the comp plan. And it says to implement changes to the zoning that supports community health and well-being, context-sensitive design, environmental protection, and climate change mitigation and preparedness. And so really thinking about how we as humans can live in the environment in a way that that feels right and respectful for the community of Charlottesville. Next slide, please. I will say this is really important, even though I'm going to talk about specific pieces of the code, all of the rules work together. So no one metric, no one rule really stands alone. All of these pieces work together and achieve the outcomes that were outlined in the comprehensive plan. So as we're talking about maybe building height or a streetscape standard, those aren't isolated on their own. They really are working together to achieve these outcomes. So you have to really think about all of these things as a system. Next slide. So let's dig into neighborhood scale. You can go on to the next slide. What is a human scale neighborhood? What does that even mean? And these ideas really come from your comp plan and best practice in urban design. Human scale neighborhoods, they have characteristics like they're comfortable and safe for a lot of different modes of travel. So whether you're driving, you're riding transit, you're taking a bike or other micromobility, you're walking, and really any age or any ability. You have safe options for everybody, and it's inclusive and accessible to diverse community members, and that's diverse in every sense of the word, economically, racially, different backgrounds. So really making sure that is a complete community that's accessible to everyone, and it provides places for people to live in every aspect of that word. Where are you working, learning, shopping, dining, worshiping, or gathering? Making sure that the neighborhood has all of those things. And ultimately that they're sustainable and resilient. There's a lot baked into that, particularly with climate change. So we are thinking about that as well. Next slide. So here's some ways that we have been thinking about that through the process and some of the specific metrics that you'll see that really implement this idea of human scale neighborhoods. The first really started way back when you were thinking about the land use mapping in the comp plan. A lot of the land uses that got applied were thinking about these things like community amenities. So this was a really early map. And then that land use took into consideration those community amenities to make sure that people had access to that, really is the idea of a complete neighborhood. And then as we were thinking about translating those land uses into zoning, we also thought about the Streets That Work map. And that really is integrating, do the neighborhoods have all of the elements that people need to live, and then how will they get from point A to point B? What do those streets look like, and making sure that we take into consideration all of those for the future. Next slide. So blocks and streetscapes, those are two rules that you will find in the development standards article, and you'll see that one of the ways that we're thinking about that is it illustrated by the difference in something like an Emmett Street grid versus a Belmont Street grid. So we have requirements in there for certain block sizes, certain block lengths and perimeters to get at something that's a bit more walkable, and it's safer for all of those different types of transit users. And you can just tell that inherently the Belmont Street grid, it lends a more human scale than something like an Emmett Street. So as the Emmett Street area develops over time, we want to make sure that those blocks and those streetscapes, so what does the sidewalk look like, what do the street trees look like, that becomes something that is more human scaled over time. Next slide. Another way that we're thinking about this is outdoor amenity space. So I wanted to provide two examples, one that's more of a historic example and one that is more of a modern, higher intensity example. Outdoor amenity space is something that is required in most all of the zoning districts. And we also have specific requirements for the quality of that open space. So it can't just be kind of a green patch that doesn't do a whole lot. There are other requirements for the pedestrian connectivity, the building, the way the building has to front the street and how it has to front that courtyard, what the landscaping needs to be. So there's tree preservation and stormwater elements involved in that. And so thinking about this outdoor amenity space as that community gathering space is important. And we're thinking about that in the standards for outdoor amenity space. You can find that in the rules portion of the code in Article 2. Next slide, please. Another way we're thinking about that, it's not just the physical form, but it's also the uses that are allowed. So thinking about that evolution, as James talked about, for economic opportunity. One of the things that we're thinking about in the alternative forms that you'll find in the zoning districts, as well as on the use table, and where certain uses are allowed and under what circumstances, that really is where you get into some of that smaller scale neighborhood serving, retail, neighborhood restaurants, even office space, things like that. I wanted to provide a couple of examples that are historic and existing in the community already. And these really range from this example in North Downtown that is a business that just occupies a house form. That probably was a residential house at some point in time. The next example at 10th and Page is a house that had a shop front sort of accessory unit that may have been a garage at some point, honestly, that got renovated to be more of a storefront. So it's sort of an addition version. And then the Belmont version that really was built to purpose as that more traditional storefront on the bottom with a resident above, that sort of shop and resident situation. So these are good examples of what we're trying to incorporate in those alternative forms and in those neighborhood scale uses. Next slide, please. We're going to jump down a bit from neighborhood scale to building scale. I want to give you a couple of examples of how we're thinking about human scale in the building scale. Next slide. So what is a human scale building? What are the types of things that we're thinking about from an urban design best practice? These generally have characteristics like they're context sensitive in scale and design. So that means, how are the higher intensity districts transitioning to lower intensity districts? And then how are things like the entrances or the transparency of that facade, how are they responding to the context of that existing area? I think this image does a good job of showing how, things like porches, doors that face the street, parking that's either on the street or sort of tucked to the side, it gives a certain human scale environment. And that's something that we're thinking about in the rules. And that really ties in the second point, prioritizing pedestrian-oriented uses and the design along the street. So one thing that we really focus on in the code is being more prescriptive along the street and providing a bit more flexibility back sort of interior to the lot. And part of that is just reducing the impact of vehicles. Next slide. So what are some specific ways that we're doing that? One, for building scale, there are several, I talked about how rules really work in conjunction with one another. As you're evaluating building scale, one thing I encourage you to do is not just think about building height or building width or footprint or building coverage as a snapshot on their own. All four of these fundamentally work together really closely, and that outcome of all four of those things result in a building scale. So it can result in something that it's more neighborhood scale development. So that's the example here on the left. This is from Belmont, where you have, even though it's a modern construction house, it does still have a similar width, a similar height, and sort of similar entrance feel to its neighbors. And that really is a result of that height and width, and even the footprint and building coverage is quite similar. So even though it's new construction, it does feel like it's a similar scale because all those four elements work together. And then on the other end of the spectrum, this is larger scale development that would be in the higher intensity districts. We're still thinking about what that means for that to be a human scaled environment, because these buildings can get quite large. This is an example that shows how building width really starts to incorporate some of that those human scale elements. So this is a really long building, but because of some building width standards, there was a break that was required in the middle of it. So you get the feeling that it's not just one 1,000 foot long building that just goes on for a very long city block. It has a break in it, and it feels like a bit of relief to provide some interest as a pedestrian, and also makes the building feel less looming as you're walking by on the street. So those rules for height, width, footprint, and building coverage, they're calibrated at both ends of the spectrum, and they all work together to ultimately result in different building scales. Next slide. Another key piece of this is the transition between lower intensity districts and higher intensity districts. So one thing you'll find in the code is this idea of transitions, and we have both across the street transitions. So when a lower intensity district sits on the same street from a higher intensity district, we want to make sure that transition, it feels, we call it like facing like buildings. So we want the scale to feel similar, even though it's a lower intensity district and higher intensity district across the street. And that's the same for across lot lines. So imagine a lower intensity district backing up to a higher intensity district. We want to make sure that higher intensity district doesn't loom over the lower intensity district that's back behind it. So we have rules for both of those scenarios, and there are several different flavors of transitions, I'll call it, that are in the code, and you'll find that in the development standards portion. Next slide. And the thing I'll end on are all of these rules that we have for building features. This really thinks about it's what we call frontage. So it's how the public realm, so the sidewalk, the street, really interfaces with that private building face. And a lot of the metrics that we're talking about, it's the same words, but the differences in the metrics and the number that you see on the table in each zoning district, they result in different outcomes. So it's sort of the same idea as building scale, but these are really building frontage elements. And so the way that we control things like ground story height, the transparency and entry requirements, the build to zone and that range, and the active depth requirement, those are the same 5 things in both of these instances. So on the mall, and then in a more residential setting, but the way those all interact together and what those metrics ultimately say are required result in these different outcomes. And so we're thinking about all those things in conjunction, and it's making sure that we have that human scaled building, that we get things like doors facing the street, and transparency. It's the urban design best practice of eyes on the street, having a friendly facade. And it really starts to build that more human-scaled, community-oriented environment. I believe that's my last slide. Yes, so we can dig into those specifically, but wanted to give you all just some context to understand how we take these best practices of urban design and the goals that you have in the comp plan, and how those end up resulting in these numbers in the tables on each of the zoning districts and embedded in the development standards. So I'll pass it over to James and let you all continue the discussion from there.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to add anything. I think at this point, we're ready to go into questions and discussion.
Yeah,
James, can we get a copy of that PowerPoint, please?
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
really helped clarify some things for
Yep.
me. I mean, I'm a visual
Missy, could I ask you to email that to council? Thank you.
person. Thank you.
so, I had a question about on the second slide where they were talking about upzoning and the infrastructure. And for me, it was a question of the infrastructure and how is the timing and the pacing of that, because some of the concerns that we have received, and I believe most of us have because most of them went to the whole council, is that the zoning will propose to be increased on my street or my area, but there's no sidewalks or the streets are narrow, so I just want to know, about the pace of the infrastructure, because I know that we can require some improvements. I just want to know how that's
Sure.
going to work.
So, and there's one of the memos that's in your packet digs into the infrastructure issue in greater detail. So that's one that's worth taking another look at. There's a couple of aspects to that. In our upcoming meeting, we're going to be talking about the rate of change and the population aspects of this. But I think the main point to take away at this point is that the rate of change we're anticipating is incremental over time. This isn't, I want to emphasize, a zoning ordinance is not a development plan. It's a body of regulations. And so we can anticipate that this change is going to be over time, and it's going to be in concert with all the activities that the city is engaged in now to build out our sidewalk network, build out bike lanes, improve our transit system, continue our efforts to upgrade our water and sewer system and all of those things. Then the other thing to note is, of course, as we do today, every project that's subject to site plan review, part of that review is looking at what are the capacity issues and what are the things that need to be upgraded. Built into the zoning ordinance is a requirement that you upgrade your streetscape when you add in a new building, so that we're ensuring that everything we've done to require that building to be community-oriented and contributing towards walkability and pedestrian safety
Yeah.
carries over into the street in front of it and actually has a streetscape that provides those things.
Yes, sir. But, I'm just thinking about in that study that Chrissy mentioned, that is fascinating. UCLA
Mm-hmm.
Lewis Policy Center, I think it was. So, as I recall, one of the things that it said is that, if you go incremental or, smaller, then property owners or homeowners, and so, but what you just said was that?
Well, no. So what that point was making is that if you aim at the smaller the land area you aim your zoning change at, the less competition you've created in the land market, and therefore the more you're driving prices, more you risk the potential of driving land prices up. Whereas a broader-based rezoning means that if I am a developer looking for a piece of property, I have choices. I'm not stuck in a situation where I go to this piece of property,
I see. Mhm.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it moves the control ultimately from the property owner to the developer, which is effectively to moving it more towards the buyer or the renter at the other end.
Mhm.
And so that broader rezoning serves to stabilize that risk of price increase.
Can I add, just interrupting you a
No,
second
no.
here? You were talking about the UCLA study, which I have not seen, and I wanted to make sure that I understood it, or at least understood the conclusion that was being presented by Christie. I wrote down the first part, that a modest upzoning benefits the present owners, and then the way it was, the adjective that was used was a broad upzoning. And that seems to get to the issue that you're mentioning, Mr. Freeze, about, if you only upzone part of the city, but not all of the city. And since whatever we're going to do is highly likely to affect just about all of the city, and we're not picking and choosing neighborhoods in that way, although some people have asked us to do that, that I haven't seen any support for that. But what I'm more concerned about is, if we think about, maybe the best way to think about it graphically is modest versus broad being a two-dimensional concept, but I'm thinking of it in a three-dimensional concept where it's the degree of expansion that we are permitting in a particular location. Intensity, really, depth, to use my three-dimensional metaphor. And I'm wondering whether the notion of breadth means literally the two-dimensional, how we spread it across the city, or whether the same analysis applies once you add the question of intensity, intense versus modest.
From the, I pulled it up from that abstract of the paper. It's defined as roughly 6 to 10 units on a large share of parcels as defined from 25 to 50% of parcels in the city. So for the purposes of this study, they really would be talking about what is our medium intensity residential and not larger intensity.
Yeah. I want to caution against the specific examples that they provide versus the broader perspective that the paper is presenting. And what we like about this paper is that it very clearly lays out the concept that has been behind this approach that's been taken in communities across the country, most significantly and earliest by Minneapolis. But what it's really getting at is the idea of competition, right? If I'm a developer seeking to do particularly small-scale infill development, such as what we're talking about and what we're trying to promote, are there multiple properties available that I can purchase, or is there really just one? Because, or a small number. Because if there's a small number, that transfers the leverage to the seller. And so whatever value there is going to be captured by a greater degree by the seller of the land, so the landowners benefit. Whereas if there's a wider range, the leverage, more competition in that marketplace, the leverage shifts to the buyer and therefore can be incorporated in, then allows the buyer then in a competitive marketplace to lower a price to where the community can make that purchase or make that lease.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, and I think the way I understood what they were talking about in terms of a broader zoning would be both geographic and also the degree of intensity. So to me, it's both of those components to the mayor's metaphor.
So I keep getting questions about this as we get our probably 30 emails a day on the topic. I don't know how many it's been for you all. When we talk about comparable cities, what are we talking about? What kinds of cities or what cities are there that have done the kind of rezoning that we're talking about? We've talked a little bit about Minneapolis. We've talked, I've heard about a number of other places. Fairly recently, the Pew Charitable Trust study that I sent around to everybody mentioned Minneapolis, it mentioned Tyson's Corner, it mentioned two other places I'm blanking on right now. And when I mentioned this to the critics of the plan, they say, yeah, right, okay, 4 cities out of how many thousands in the United States? And I'm just wondering, is there a list of, and I don't need to have you list them off today while we're on the microphone, but is there some well-accepted list of places that have been doing the kinds of things that we're talking about doing that we could look and say, it really wasn't the end of civilization as we know it?
I know one example is Walla Walla. They're about
Right.
our population and size, and I think they did something similar to our changes for RA and RB, but they didn't do anything equivalent to like our mixed-use commercial corridors. But I think they're about 40,000 people with less than 10 square miles.
And one of the things that I read about Walla Walla was that there was a study that compared their rate of rental increase to Seattle's, which had apparently, Seattle had undertaken a much more vigorous upzoning. And they found that that the rents in Walla Walla went up faster than the rents in Seattle, tending to prove that Economics 101 still applies to the housing market, that more supply helps hold prices down. But anyway, that's one thought. When you mentioned Walla Walla, I was thinking about that. So, and back to my question, are there lists of cities that have gone through all of this that we can look at and say, okay, this is an example that it's about the same size, it's got this, it's got this, it's got this. Anybody would look at that and say that's a comparable to Charlottesville, whereas they might look at Minneapolis and say, nah, that's not comparable. I'll put that to anybody in the room who can answer it, Christie or anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of the movement in this, because as you guys probably well know, the politics are difficult on this type of strategy. And so a lot of the movement in this space has moved to the state level. So we've got state of California, state of Oregon, state of Montana, Vermont in the last couple months. Christy, you remember who else on the state level has done it?
Those are the main ones.
Yeah, I was trying to, actually,
And
you
what have
mentioned
they
Maine.
done?
They've done a statewide upzoning.
Statewide,
So
to say
California basically just
one
said-
lot equals 3 uses or something.
California basically said minimum of 4.
Okay.
Oregon said minimum of 4 in statewide and minimum of 6 in cities, I think. I don't remember. So it's a lot of the action has moved to a statewide level is really the answer there because of
Okay.
the politics. Because it's perceived as being more readily doable as a political matter at the statewide level.
So it's easier for us to think about it on a statewide level versus what Michael was saying as it relates to comparable, because Charlottesville is 10 square miles with X amount of thousands of people. And I can see Lloyd's point. If you're comparing Charlottesville to Minneapolis, Minneapolis is a lot larger, the population is larger. So are you saying within the states that you were talking about, there are locations that are similar to ours? Or are you saying what these states did was statewide and not, I think the word might be municipality, but I'm not sure.
I'm just noting that lately a lot of the action in this space has been at statewide level.
Okay.
I mean, I
Which
think
means it'd be hard to do comparison cases to
it's,
cities, like what happened to city. If you had like a Nashville, I don't know, cities that were similar to us, say a dozen of them that had done this same sort of thing over the last 10 years, you might be able to build up a comparison sample.
Mhm.
But I don't think that exists.
yeah, I think we're at a moment where we're experiencing a tipping point
Yes.
Okay.
in what's happening around this space, because
So
it's,
some people would say we're running off a cliff, others would say we're trailblazers.
Mhm.
right.
So
I get it.
Well, and it occurs to me, one of the reasons why the move may be to undertake it at the state level is that they could change the state's property law as a whole.
that's right.
Whereas we can't, and it's not purely an issue of the Dillon rule, it's an issue of how municipalities are defined versus the state powers and so on. Typically, municipalities do not have the power to change state property law, only the state legislatures can, so.
But I think scale is important, but the principles remain the same. The basic Economics 101 principle and understanding what your demand looks like and how that relates to supply, particularly to the degree to which your ordinance is restricting supply.
So the next question that I had, and just sort of going back through my notes on the presentation, that's directly related to what Christy was talking about was, Christy, you were helping to define the notion of neighborhood scale as a scale that provides places for people to live, work, gather, and there are a bunch of other activities that you mentioned there all at once also. And it occurs to me that in our residential neighborhoods, we have not, and we have intentionally not, provided space for people to work and to gather and do some of those other things. To live, yes. To play, yes. To go to, a local school, yes. But not really, we have not previously contemplated a zoning ordinance that, that intended to encourage in a residential neighborhood, working, gathering, and so on, at least in the R1, R2 kinds of zones that we've had so far. And so to that degree, that would mark a significant change from what we have been, how we've been trying to organize our zoning ordinance. To think that, hey, we're gonna do all these things in the same neighborhood. And I'm just wondering, do other folks on council want to be endorsing that goal as applicable to all neighborhoods? Or is there some, currently, the current mentality is that about half of the city is living, yes, that's fine, but not working and gathering and other activities.
I'm definitely comfortable with it, and am more uncomfortable with having a zoning code that says the government is telling you it is absolutely illegal and there is no mechanism by which you could ever open a business. And how we currently have it with the special use permit process, I think will give us a little bit of ability to kind of evaluate what that's really looking at in practice, although I suspect we probably won't get too many even coming in. But in general, I think it's a positive thing for economic development. I would think probably we'd have more success if you're looking at replicating areas like downtown Belmont, where there's more like a strip adjacent to a neighborhood that is all smaller scale commercial. But to have that potentially embedded within neighborhoods, if it's something someone's opening in their house, I'm fine with. And it's just one example. I know there's a lot of members of our refugee community who, if they had that opportunity to open a small restaurant out of their house, I think they would take advantage of it, and they just currently couldn't. And I see positive there. That's not too disruptive.
Yeah. Please, sir.
Yeah, so I'm gonna jump around just a hair, and this gets into some other, I'll call it tactical questions that maybe we can talk about later, and just in terms of the process. Philosophically, I am supportive of what Councilor Payne just said. I think that is, I don't have a problem with it, and I think that is a good long-term, I would love for our city in 20 years to be the kind of place where those sorts of enterprises could flourish, the ones that are listed in here. The one thing I will say is that even if we didn't do that now, the current code allows home occupations, which is distinct from businesses per se. So it wouldn't be the case that all businesses, wouldn't be able to occur. Some would not, like restaurants, for example. All of these things are so interwoven, it's hard to know how to pull apart the sweater. But, for me, the philosophical perspective is one. The other is the sort of moving us from current state to future state, and how we get from here to there. If that were something that was removed, the need to have, or the desire to have commercial, what's been laid out here in terms of commercial options, I would be fine with deferring that to 5 years from now or something.
I guess a question, just in terms of trying to get the policy right, is we already made a major concession to people who had a concern about that, and having the commercial uses be by special use permit versus by right. So there is a fundamental concession to that concern. What about that is not enough?
I don't know, Michael.
Of course, the discussion last night was maybe
Yeah.
we shouldn't be having special use permits.
It's not clear to me where we stand on that very.
Well, in
topic.
the written draft we have, it is special use permit.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
I think it would depend on, it would depend on what the criteria are that are baked into the special use. you know, how staff would manage that. If it just became, I could see one person saying, oh, well, you gave them a special use permit, I'm 5 doors down, why won't you give me a special use permit? So fleshing out everything that's involved, I mean, at a conceptual level, yeah, having a special use permit does provide some protection, and I appreciate that point. But I think there's more that's going to have to be fleshed out there, and I can appreciate the fact that neighborhoods, particularly if we're committed to MIR, which I personally am, if I had to pick one thing in this whole sort of stew to wait on to get the bulk of it through, that is one piece that I'd be willing to.
And you
to
think it
sacrifice.
would change their support for the plan?
I don't know. I don't know about that. All I'm saying is that if I look across this field or table or whatever metaphor of all of the things between us and a better future state, which I think will involve much more housing across the city, and I am willing to follow my sword about medium intensity. I'm not willing to follow on something like this. I don't think the commercial piece is essential over the next 5 years. I support it long-term for the reasons that you mentioned. I've defended it to people, but I'm laying it out there as something that I don't think is essential for this to work.
So we had last time we had at one of our joint meetings, we had a pretty good discussion about this, about the commercial aspect of it, whether it should be 2,000 or 4,000 square feet in. And the concern that came up was, because I like the idea of kind of a neighborhood, little store where you don't necessarily have to go.
The term is bodega.
Bodega,
That's it.
yeah, that sounds smooth. But how do
you're
you?
smooth, so use a smooth
Yeah,
tongue.
yeah. How do you keep that store from, for someone that's heading out to town, that they want to swing by there to get something? How do you handle that parking? And I know we talked about maybe some of it could be in the back. That's how what I'm grappling with. I mean, as a transportation planner, I like the idea of having those things close, those things. It's been about 15, 20 years since I did that, but it brought back memories seeing those slides and things. But anyway, so that's, I like the idea of ideally having those features in all throughout the city as well.
One way I would suggest, if we do decide to go down that path, is maybe I would be willing to even say 1,000 square feet and have the requirement that the owner live on property. I'm not opposed to the idea philosophically. I can appreciate the fact that people feel who own their homes, and I realize this is only one part of our constituency. Most of the people that live here rent or are transient, but we also have to deal with the fact or acknowledge the fact that for many people, their home is their main asset. So if there is a way with this one particular piece, we can make it easier for now, I'm okay with either deferring it or going with something smaller.
So Brian, you don't feel that the special use permit matrix is sufficient for you?
I haven't seen one yet. I mean, maybe I've missed it. I know there is the notion of a special use permit. I think it's for commercial. I think it would not be by council approving it. It would be by city staff, as I recall.
The current draft is proposed, and this was maintained last night, the Planning Commission's decision last night, is that the commercial and residential is by special use permit, which is granted by council
Okay.
upon recommendation of Planning Commission following public hearing.
And we could even refine the use matrix to say there are certain, again, only certain
Certain
business
criteria.
types would be
Yeah.
allowed.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious of when they showed those pictures,
Which
the 10th and page one, that,
I remember where that is.
yeah,
I'm
well,
trying to
it's
figure out what it is too.
it's
I'm
like-
on that slide right now. I'm
it's
trying to figure it out.
It's like across the street from where the community garden is, and one block off of Preston area. So, but I'm trying to get an idea about how big that Like, I think that Chrissy said it may have been a converted garage or something like that. I'm curious to how big that is. You know,
Can I
that's
ask a
for.
quick question,
yeah.
just to the five of us here. I mean, straw poll, how do people, again, philosophically, I'm open to the idea. I would think a smaller square footage and the requirement to have someone live there with this robust special use permit. I mean, how do people feel about that?
Yeah, I think that if it comes to council and we can put some, parameters on it, Michael had just thrown out a few, I think that I definitely could live with that.
Okay.
And I would agree with that, and it'll give us a sense to even see what doesn't come, I think it's a very first baby step to 5-10 years down the road,
Okay.
evaluating what it is. And I think the special use permit is a strong practical limit on it. And I think if we completely removed even that, I don't think it's going to address the concerns that people have fundamentally with where the plan is at, to be perfectly honest. I think
But-
it's,
I have two basic issues with the special use permit notion. The first, commented on last night, is the amount of time and money it takes to get a special use permit. If you're talking about some refugee family wanting to create a restaurant on their first floor, that ain't gonna happen. It is not gonna happen with a special use permit. The second problem that I have is that I'm not sure that I understand how the city would go about, the concept that I've tried to talk about is rationing. How we would ration if we have a whole block long of places that are permitted, that are gonna be RB, let's say, or even RA. I mean, however you wanna do it so that you could have a place here and a place here and a place here, all commercial uses. How do you say, we've already got two on this block? Is that a permissible basis for denying a special use permit? Mr. City Attorney?
Typically, supply and demand would not be a basis. It would have to be a land use basis for granting and conversely denying the special use permit. But I think the concept of saying, well, there are two home occupations involving restaurants on this block, so we're going to deny the special use permit because we don't want a third, I think would be concerning from a land use standpoint and likely subject the city to legal challenge.
Thank you.
So can we, and this is all theoretical, we can say, well, the traffic is too bad, is bad on that street. It could be because it's already one or two already on the street.
So, Mr. Vice Mayor, your point is very well taken. So there are a number of other issues, traffic and traffic safety, that could bear on what I'll call questions of saturation of certain home uses.
and
But
you.
wouldn't that be,
Oh, go ahead.
but wouldn't that be something in your special use permit you would be considering before moving forward? You'd be looking at all of those things, because Juan talked about the traffic. And in some neighborhoods, if you look at, thank you for the slides, Missy. If you look at 10th and Page or the Belmont pictures, depending on if those were the types of things that happened, there's a certain amount of traffic that goes along with it. So if the street is like this, and you already have two, if you had three, the street's not gonna grow. You can't expand it. And so if you're looking at additional factors, that's a yes or no type of a situation. Am I?
I think you're
Right.
correct, and the way it typically gets articulated is at a point, public health and safety becomes an issue because congestion becomes an issue, that sort of thing. And there are other land use considerations that are jumping to mind. I'll defer to the expert there. But again, the focus is on the kinds of land use issues that revolve around whether to grant or not to grant. Now, within that, obviously, saturation, I'll just put that in quotes, saturation leads to those things, but that's very different from saying,
No.
we've got 2 restaurants on this block, we, city council, are making a market determination
But-
that that's enough.
But you could.
And denying the special use permit.
You could, in some fantasy novel world where 5 of the houses on a block have become home-occupied businesses, or there's 4 of them already that have been approved, there's a 5th, council would be able to say that the traffic in that context is an adverse neighborhood impact, and we're denying the SUP for that reason, because of the adverse neighborhood impacts.
Correct, and the effect of that on public health and safety, which that's always within council's purview.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would be comfortable with that. I think the mayor's, again, philosophically, I don't have a problem with this notion of having businesses in neighborhoods. I appreciate why some people do, but I don't. But, you know, just thinking sort of tactically how we move this down the road, it sounds like, Mr. Mayor, you're still, you have some philosophical concerns about it, but even if we did the special use permit approach, it doesn't sound like you feel like that's really, it's kind of a fig leaf or whatever the.
Well, I'm sort of, in a sense, arguing both sides of it. I don't think that having a special use permit process will allow for this sort of organic, hey, let's get together and have a restaurant kind of an approach. Because it, you know, at least present experience has been that it takes a bloody long time, and lawyers and surveyors and engineers and everybody else getting into the picture, and site plans and everything else, and probably $20,000 to $50,000 in expense to be able to generate an application for a special use permit. And so unless we're gonna have some expedited process for a special use permit, don't kid yourself. This is not gonna be the way mom and pop decide to have an Afghanistan restaurant in their basement.
Right, and I appreciate that point, but I mean, to Michael's point, it at least, maybe not mom and pop, but maybe mom and pop and uncles and aunts, you know, I don't know, but some.
Or mom and pop in the community investment collaborative,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe the SUP process could be streamlined or made more appropriate for this scale. I don't know, but I do feel like, I mean, either we're philosophically against having this, you know, or we're tactically willing to wait and do this over the course of the next 5 years, or we say, okay, we do have something that is in place, a mechanism to prevent this from getting out of control. And I think that we do, based off what I'm hearing about the special use permit,
But
which
just
apparently I
because you
forgot.
have something in place doesn't mean that, in my mind, just because you have something in place doesn't mean that because it's enacted tomorrow, it's gonna happen in 3 years.
That's true.
But it allows people to make a decision. If I wanna convert my basement to be the neighborhood bakery, and I'm not a baker, so don't y'all go there, but if I wanted to do that, I would have an opportunity to think it through and do what I needed to do as it relates to the business plan and the this, that, and the third, before I even said, well, let me do this special use permit, and everybody says no. I mean, I think that that's something that people that want to do, like what we see here on 10th and Page and Belmont, are gonna think about this before they do it. I mean, it's not,
Yeah, I agree, and I guess after the conversation, and this is why this is helpful to me, because it's not about trying to figure out the political middle here, it's about
Right.
listening to people, my colleagues who I respect and think are very
Right.
smart. I guess sort of where I'm landing right now is, I do still have some concerns about how the community, one part of the community feels about commercial
Correct.
spaces. I do think with a more robust, you know, special use permit regime, that we can refine over time, the odds of runaway, 4 bakeries on a row are pretty low, and so I could personally vote for that piece.
Yeah, I mean, when y'all were talking about that, I'm thinking about, the impact, if you don't want to have anything to do with the commercial in your neighborhood. And when you bought that house 20 or 30 years ago, you had no idea that would be there, unlike someone who, recently bought a house by an airport and then complains about the noise
Right.
and the things like that. So it's something that we have to, that we have to kind of factor in that impact of that. But
Do you think, the notion of a special use permit,
I do, because I did that, many of those kind of special use permits when I was doing planning, particularly for home occupations. And one of the things that I did is that I talked to the neighborhoods, and I included to the board of supervisors kind of their comments and the impact of the neighbors.
I see.
And I factored that in my.
so you're saying at sort of the grassroots level, you think there would be some checks and balances?
It definitely is, and we know in this community, we're going to get, we definitely will get some comments from the residents there, but we're going to get probably some from people that
Right.
aren't, directly impacted. And I think that that's good. We want that, and they'll be able to share it with whoever's on council, and they just have to
Yeah.
factor that in.
Well, I have a question about, I don't know who I asked, but I'm looking at the little slide presentation here, and we're talking about rules for building scale, and you have across the street transitions, and you have across lot line transitions. Now, when I just look at this, it appears to me, and maybe I'm wrong, so that's why I'm asking the question. It appears to me that the across-the-street transitions are at one spot, but the lot land transitions look very overpowering to the building, to the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's
So,
the purpose of the step back, right? The reason,
so can someone explain to me why one looks more overpowering than the other, and and you see the house right there? To me, it just looks like,
I think what they will say is that what would be even more overpowering is if you just had a wall that went all the way up to the top, as opposed to what they've got now, Leah, is a step back. The first edge goes up to a certain
Yeah.
height, then over, and I think that's really kind of all you're going to be able to do to minimize.
the
transition, yeah.
overpowering.
I think that is their stab attempt to minimize that step back piece.
Christie,
Okay.
can you comment on that? And also note what else is in there in addition to the step back?
Sure. So yeah, the setback is really the key from a bulk and massing perspective. But another key component of this is in that if you look on the across lot line transition diagram, there's a dimension line A,
Yes.
and
I
there's some
see it.
landscaping in there.
Yes.
And that really indicates that there are transition buffers that are also required.
Okay.
And so that requires a setback from that lot line. And then there are also landscaping standards associated with that that help screen from that lower intensity district. And so it's both a bulk and massing piece, but another component is that landscaping. And that really helps from if you imagine like standing at the ground level, because really you perceive a couple stories up, and that's what we feel as humans. And that landscaping is really meant to help with that eye level view of that higher intensity district.
And we're presuming that we're planting something in this A here, in this A section. I'm on the lot land transition now. So we're presuming that what we're landscaping here in the little A section is going to grow so it doesn't feel so overpowering. Am I?
Yes, I think
That's right. And if you
understood.
have your code book next to you, I think you do. If you look at the pages starting at 4-57,
Okay, hold on.
4-58,
Oh,
and
yeah.
59,
Okay, yep. Okay,
Those all describe, so if you're in a low or a moderate or a high, so your transition type will tell you what that landscape buffer needs to be.
okay.
And so let's say you're a low requirement.
Mhm.
So you either can do the transition screen low, which is the fence plus landscaping option,
Okay,
or transition screen low 2, which is a more intense landscaping that has things like evergreens that create a bit more solid,
okay.
full landscaping screen.
Well, now that
So
is
those
what
are
it
really
says.
tied together.
Yep, thank you.
Christy, is it not true that there is a range of different transition types, and the idea there is that the more the difference between one zoning district and the other in terms of what's allowed, the greater the level of transition that's required, including distance and step back?
That's right. And so if you want to see those different requirements on 4-48, there's a matrix there, and you can see that relationship. So if it's a lower intensity district and it's next to sort of one increment up, then there's the lowest amount of transition required. But as that higher intensity district, as that increment grows and the difference between the two grows, then there's more transition required to mitigate that difference of scale.
Did you talk, and I've read through it, but just for our conversation in more depth, let's say you've got our highest intensity uses at 8, 10, or 12 stories next to a residential neighborhood, which is currently in there around 10th and Page, East High, other areas. What does that transition look like? Because the examples you provided earlier all make sense, but are very, very different situations than that.
Yeah, so that's going to be a transition type D. So that would be on 4-51 if you're looking at a common lot line, so across a lot line transition. And then on 4-54 across a street. And so you'll see that as that building grows, transition type D actually requires multiple step backs if you build that taller building. So someone in an 8-story district could volunteer to build, a 5-story building, and then they would only have to have one step back. But if you're going any higher than that, then you have to have a second step back. So it's trying to further mitigate both in step backs. And I will add that particularly on the common lot line one, so on 4-51, that building setback and that buffer requirement is the greatest requirement of any of the transitions. So your whole building and your landscaping has to be the greatest version.
Okay.
So it's not just the massing of the building stepping back, it's also the whole building has to be farther back with that transition.
All right, thank you.
Stepping back, just to use a word, to the commercial piece. So I see here, forgot, but this, in the use table, there's an S with an asterisk for people following this at home.
Where are you?
On the use table, say go to 3-5,
Okay,
in terms of commercial uses within residential spaces. So you can have general food and beverage with a special use. You can have lodging with a special use permit. Medical, office, personal service. Is there any, where did the 4,000 square foot number come from? And I thought in the meeting that Juan referred to earlier, that was a source of great consternation. People wanted to cut it in half.
And note that the use table references 4,000 square feet because the use, we're trying to divide between basically small scale and large scale of those different types of establishments. But then when you go to the actual commercial standards, it'll note that in any R district and any residential district, the maximum size for that use is 2,500 square feet.
Okay.
And that number could be reduced even further.
Okay.
So,
I'm not sure.
Chrissy, could you
That
give the
sounds like
page number?
That's a conflict.
It's
Explain.
It's basically saying, here's the standard on the use table, but then in this district, the standard is tighter.
Okay.
That's right. And that's on 3-32.
3-30.
And
I did notice
I
the
think that's,
discrepancy. though.
this is a really good point when you're thinking about how these things can be controlled. And, criteria for special use permit is one way, and obviously there are a lot of legal implications with that. The second is in this use standard. So right now, as you see on 3-32, there's a specification that any commercial use in the R district where it's allowed, it's limited to 2,500 square feet per lot, and then there's an allowance that you can use the shopfront house alternative form. There can be additional use standards baked into this. So if there's, just some general agreement that, I don't know, there
I'll add
may
one
be
for you.
some
The planning
like
commission-
operational hours, for example, that can be added as a use standard. So this is a way that specific criteria in certain districts can be attached to certain uses.
Right. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Christy. I was going to note that at the planning commission last night, Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Zoliates can correct me, but I believe the planning commission indicated that they wanted to add a requirement in that section to say that there has to be at least one residential unit on the site.
Okay,
So that would be added right into that section that we're looking at.
understood.
So I guess, and maybe I'm obsessing over something I shouldn't be, but if on 3.5, we say we'll allow in an RA and RB, so on, up to a general food and beverage, up to 4,000 square feet by special use permit, and on 332, we say, but only up to 2,500 square feet, why is that not a conflict?
It's not, so again, that 4,000 is a use category that applies across all districts. In that particular district, it has an S and an asterisk, and what it's saying is you need a special permit and you have to meet additional conditions. And then it refers you to the page number that has those additional conditions, and one of those additional conditions is you can't get to 4,000 square feet, you can only get to 2,500 or 1,000 or whatever it ends up getting set at. And then the additional condition that you have to provide a residential unit on the site, and again, that list can be added to
Okay.
as appropriate.
Because somewhere else you can't do full.
Yeah,
Yes, and somewhere else you can do
As
4,000.
opposed to creating a second line that would allow it between 2,500 and 4,000 square feet.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Just clarify.
So it occurs to me, and to sort of continue on the question of commercial uses and so on, I don't remember having heard, and maybe I don't have the comp plan in front of me, that one of the purposes of this entire endeavor was specifically from the beginning to allow for a greater degree of entrepreneurial opportunity. Did that get added into the process at some point, or did I miss something early on?
I guess for me, maybe it's how I interpret the comprehensive plan. I see references to that concept in various aspects of the land use section and in the economic development section. And I can dig out what references I'm looking at that lead me to that. I'm happy to share
Well,
those.
and I also note, as I did at an earlier meeting, that at the very beginning of this document, we have removed one of the purposes that we had declared in our present zoning ordinance, which is to regulate and restrict the location of trades, industries, and residences. We are no longer going to use that as a goal, although that sort of seems inherent in the notion of zoning. And I'm wondering whether that represents basically a reflection of the fact that we're going to be allowing trades, industries, and residences to commingle.
No, my take on that, and Christy, maybe you know the answer to this as well, but I'd simply take that as we wrote that section to match the state code, and the state code doesn't have that reference in it, as I understand it. But again, if that's something we want to add back in, we're happy to do so. Because as you note, it is inherently what zoning does.
Right.
Could I ask a related question then about lodging in RB and RC? So if again, thinking about pain points and what we can do to move the ball down the field, is that a pain point for people that we're allowing lodging in RB and RC? I personally I have no philosophical problems with that. I will say that if we're trying to create, if the goal of this is to create more housing for people to live in, I wonder if that cuts against it in some way, but maybe the market will sort that out for us. I don't know. To me, if someone wants to build something and they say, oh, I'm going to use this for lodging, I'd like, no, go let someone put some more lodging up, near the airport. We have a lot of hotels around here. I'm not opposed to homestays. I think that is a great thing, but what I'm seeing here seems like it's a step up from homestays, and I'm wondering, do we really want to encourage this or allow it versus, if the market were to choose one way or the other, it seems to me we want it to pick a place for people to live.
And I have a concern around that, and I recognize
the reasons. There's no easy answer. I even had a concern around the homestays with Airbnb. For that reason of taking up supply of housing, I think we're in a market with UVA graduation and football games where the market would respond in some areas disproportionately, 10th and Page in areas near the university, of buying up a meaningful amount of lots and converting them into lodging, and they would make probably a greater profit than rentals just on football games and graduation. So I do share that, or I guess not share, but I do have that concern.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's a hypothetical concern either. I think it's a very real concern in the current market. We don't have to look very far to find that.
Right.
I'm just wondering what that helps us, if the goal of this is to get more housing, one goal is to get more housing across a broad range, the very real, not just risk, actuality that people are going to take advantage of that in ways that don't help us help us achieve our goals. Why do we keep it?
Christy, feel free if you have anything on this, but I'll say from my perspective, I have no strong feelings about it, and I think it's purely a policy decision that you guys are welcome to pick either way. Christy, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'll just add that, I know that the thinking has changed a bit on homestays from what the current draft is in front of you, but the idea is that homestays was going away, and that essentially we would be defining short-term rental as that lodging, that smallest scale general lodging. And so it would be special use permit, and it would be treated the same as a bed and breakfast. So, that this would require any bed and breakfast or homestay to go through a special use permit process. But, knowing that homestays is being reevaluated, they're really, unless there is some concern or desire for there to be some bed and breakfast allowance in RB and RC, there's, again, as James said, it's a policy decision, but that's why we made that shift.
Yeah, I hope that we'll continue to streamline and modernize our rules around homestays. I don't really know where we stand on that. I have heard that we're getting better compliance. We're actually finding people who break the rules, and if we need to hire someone to make sure the rules are followed, I'm willing to support that in the next budget cycle. I do support homestays for like a person who wants to have a few places scattered around. I think they can help with housing, and I think, if we talk about entrepreneurial spirit, I think that gives people a way to make some money. So I'm an advocate for homestays, but I'm not an advocate for letting someone come in and buy, half a block of what would be medium intensity residential for UVA football games. So if there's a way to thread that needle.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
It's in line. So Brian, are you feeling that with the latter, not the homestays, but what you started out with initially, it would detract from the overarching goal of increasing more homes for people to purchase?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying?
Purchase or rent.
Okay, all right. I just needed to, I thought that's what you were saying, but I just wanted to make sure.
I think we have a lot of hotels in the city.
Well,
And-
actually, we don't. I mean, there's a lack of them. Just
Is that right?
my hat on from that tourism. That's why it's so high. We have one of the highest that rent.
Occupancy?
No, what do you pay?
cost.
Yeah,
Per
per
night.
night. Yeah.
RevPAR?
Yes, yes, rates. So, yeah, so we, there's more, we are getting more, but you know, you just try to get, room on some weekends. It's really tough. We could definitely use more, but I agree, we need to try to,
Balance.
get a handle on, I just was reading, I'm sure y'all been keeping up what's going on in Richmond, that their city council just approved it, are we dealing with, we're gonna kinda deal with this in a more holistically way next year, is that the game plan? or-
Yeah, that's where we've landed at this
Homestays?
point is homestays, yeah, that we're gonna, Planning Commission confirmed this in their deliberations last night. We're going to basically restore the existing homestay regulations to the ordinance in their recommendations that come forward to you. And then our intention at staff level is to revisit those regulations at a later date, next calendar year, to see are there any changes we need to make to improve our ability to enforce those regulations.
Okay.
So just kind of big picture, I mean, the Airbnb and those type of, they do a lot of lobbying in Richmond and Capital, to try to prevent, the information being presented, but it's out there. I mean, we can get it. I think that if we, say, we can even hire some college students, say, okay, just go to Airbnb and place and see if they line up with what we are getting paid. And I know we're having more people to do it, but I think that if we enforce, this is, we're gonna get to this next year. If we enforce it, we'll have more money to, pay people to review it and things like that. But
Yeah.
it's hard. I'm thinking, and I know I keep bringing this up, Hartman's Mill Road. If you haven't been on that road recently, you will see,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about houses just being built
Mhm.
in the, because I've talked to the neighbors and things over there.
Where?
Hartman's Mill Road.
It's a street where a lot of individuals that came to the city, they used to live in the Esmont area.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about this house and this, that neighbor told me, well, before teachers used to rent and, first, beginning teacher used to, rent that. It was many years ago, but not too long ago. If you look at it now, they've torn that down and they put in a beautiful house. And that street has one of the best views of the mountains,
Yes,
clear
it's
views of the
gorgeous.
mountains. There's 3 or 4 houses there, and all of them are pretty much Airbnb, and they are not local owners. I mean, they just been rent out all the time, and that's what we don't want. They don't have any connection with the neighbors. That if you walk down that street, the people that live there, they can talk, porches and things. In these houses, new ones, they're not.
So does that, based off of what you're saying there, would you support removing lodging from RB and RC, knowing that in the spring, we're gonna talk about
Yeah,
homestays separately, but this is a sort of a broad category?
yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I would agree with that.
Lloyd, how do you feel?
That's fine. Again, we're gonna be visiting the broader issue. I have, while I was looking at this, I have one question about something that strikes me as anomalous. On residential uses, household living, this is the very beginning of the use table, we have manufactured home park by special use permit only in RB and by right only in RX3. Is there an accident of history behind that?
I'm going to defer to Christie on that question.
That primarily reflects the current allowances today. So not necessarily a direct translation because your zoning districts aren't translating, but it's a close approximation to the allowances of where they're allowed today. And the standards associated with those are the standards that you have in your ordinance today.
I mean, I'm just curious why RB and not RC? Just, I mean, it's not a big issue, it's just anomalous. If there isn't an answer for that, that's fine. Another more substantive question. You talked, Christie, about various scales, building scales, human scale buildings, and so on. One of the early tests, I suppose, or promises that was made to us, was that when we were going to be talking about residences, and particularly RA and RB, that they would be house-sized residences, house-sized buildings. And one of the things that, as we start looking at what ends up being permitted in RB, in particular, RA also, I suppose, is I don't see any way to assure neighbors that they're going to have house-sized buildings nearby them. It seems to me that we could easily have 6 units of apartments, and if each one is going to be 1,500 square feet, we've got a 9,000 square foot building, and as I look at the various other constraints and lot sizes and coverage areas and so on, that all seems to me to be entirely possible. I'm just wondering, did we give up on the idea of house-sized buildings in RA? Did that just vanish from our thinking?
So, yeah, I mean, house size, that can go in a lot of different directions, you know.
Sure.
As far as,
Was
you
it
know,
house sized, or was it like house scale, or shape, or form? or-
The phrase I remember is house-sized. And so based on that, I went to my friends and told them, don't worry about this future land use map. The buildings that are going to be built in your neighborhood are going to be basically the same house size or house scale. I don't know for these purposes there's a distinction, but the point is that they would not be expecting, and I'll use the one example that comes most egregiously to mind, is it on Charlton, where there's that one house that was built that, it's got to be at least a 5,000 square foot, in terms of gross floor area. It's a huge building in the middle of a street, or in the middle of a block, that wound up not getting completed for various reasons. But everybody looked at that and said, good Lord, isn't there anything you can do about it?
And just-
It's an eyesore.
It's an eyesore, and it's the example that people use of, I don't want that in my neighborhood.
And just for us to be able to define it, RA, 2.5 stories maximum height, 40-foot building width. RB, 2.5 story maximum height, 40-foot building width. RC, 3-story maximum height, 70-foot building width. So that's
Without
just
the bonus densities.
correct.
Yeah.
Which, yeah.
And so if you're looking at, I mean, and I don't remember the details, because I remember figuring this out, I don't know, some months ago, but you could easily end up with a 6,000 square foot floor area building in an RA zone, and that would be typically double the size of anybody else on the block, and it isn't going to feel like a house-sized building, a house-scale building. And if that's no longer a thing in this code, I do think we ought to at least acknowledge that what we were told in the future land use map discussion has been specifically abandoned. And if we're not willing to specifically abandon it, then we ought to try to work it back into the concept.
Well, and I think,
And I wasn't there then, so.
I mean, for me, I think one of the challenges is that idea of what is house in human scale does have subjectivity to it. So when I look at these heights and widths, to me, it completely matches a neighborhood human house scale in terms of the existing pattern within neighborhoods of some townhomes, smaller apartment complexes that are mixed in with homes. And I can think of areas in my neighborhood where I live, I walk by every day, as well as canvassing throughout the city, where that pattern of development is isolated but exists, and I walk by it and it feels completely house scale. And so that's my perspective, and I know others, I guess, just have a different perspective, but to me, that's not even out of line with neighborhood scale. It's just a different type of housing product. And you could still get a McMansion that is going to have a huge footprint too.
I mean, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, this kind of came up, in one of these joint meetings, and that I was sitting back and listening. I think Carl mentioned this from the planning commission, is that it's all about design, because I'm thinking about a few weeks ago, Claudia and I were walking on Altamont, and, you know, if you walked in there, it's like, you know, it's a roundabout, and it's a
Mhm.
big, you know, apartment, in there, really nice, and it seems doable. It's big, but it's designed, there's many, you know, I don't know how old it is, but, and it has connections to the side streets and things like that. It's really, you know, but, you know, anyway, so.
Yeah, I do feel like it's something, it's certainly a subjective thing, and on paper, you know, a building that's less than 3 stories high, I guess anyone can find fault with something, but that does seem relatively small from a height perspective. And you do have, you know, you can drive to these house farms that have enormous mansions with 4 people living in them, that we could, you know, we could take the same footprint and put, you know, I don't know, 4 different units or something in.
Well,
So
But, I mean,
Are you
when
the-
we were talking about house size, actually, the distinction was made during one of the discussions about house size maybe, and then mansion size was something different. But
Oh, okay.
when I was thinking house size, I'm thinking 3,000, 4,000 square feet. I'm not thinking 6,000, 7,000 square feet. And however you end up defining it, I mean, I think if you end up with a 6,000 square foot building in an RA zone, it is going to look much larger than anything else on the block, because it will be. It'll be twice the size of anything else on the block. Now, again, maybe that's okay. It's not what we were told that we could sell to the public 2 years ago. And I think we ought to at least be honest enough to say, nah, we're not doing that anymore. And if we're not willing to say we're not doing that anymore, then we ought to go back and try to figure out how we work it into the plan.
Can I offer a third option?
Sure.
So my understanding of the house scale statement was kind of as it's being articulated here as house scale from the street, as viewed from the public realm, that new infill development fits in with the streetscape, with the image of what we're seeing. I think necessarily in order to accommodate a certain number of units, you're going to go back into the lot. But what we've focused a lot on is controlling that scale as the neighborhood presents, as the street unfolds to the person on the street.
So is that sort of the essence of form-based code? mean, is
I
that-
wouldn't call it the essence of form-based code, I just call it the essence of, that was the essence of what we were trying to accomplish.
Right.
And I mean, I think it's reasonable. There could have just, because it's subjective, there's just different understandings. I mean, my understanding was always in line with that, and kind of that what would be allowed in terms of form, and particularly in my mind, height, would be of a human scale. And I think that in terms of the height in width allowed, as well as the other design controls, I think that was met in RB and RC. But I mean, I take your point. I guess it's something that people could just have subjective different interpretations of. But that's where I'm at. I mean, I do think that the height, width, as well as the other design considerations make it something where that when you would walk it, it would feel residential neighborhood to me, like a house. And you know, the other recognition that those are specific, it will be a different housing product. I mean, you're going to be talking about people who have an opportunity to live in a small apartment complex or a small condo unit or something like that that doesn't exist now. And I guess the question is, if we're going to do that, I don't know. It would seem the only option is to just say we're not going to allow that different type of housing product to get built if under the scenario you outlaid, if your interpretation of what is house scale can include that type of housing product at all. I guess a question, if you removed the double density bonus, does your concern still remain with just what's allowed even without that double density affordable housing bonus?
Well, I've assumed that the double density affordable housing bonus is not presently on the table.
Right, I think he's asking in terms of the size, right? Like,
Correct.
Just a sort
Well,
of
I
baseline.
guess the point that really got me thinking about this is you could still have 4 units or 6 units in an apartment building that was 4,500 square feet. They would be smaller units, which automatically would make them more nearly affordable, by the way. But I was looking at some stuff from, I can't remember now what I was looking at. The assumption was that like a 3-bedroom apartment would be 1,200 to 1,500 square feet. Well, you know, to use an example of my own family, my son lives in a condo that's 1,000 square feet and has 3 bedrooms. And it's a beautiful place and it's very expensive. It's up in Massachusetts, but still, the point is that he lives a very nice life in a 1,000 square foot apartment and a 3-bedroom apartment. And so if you say, and say comparable, a 2-bedroom apartment might be 750 square feet, if we limit the size of the apartment, and then we also then say you can have 6 of them there, you can have 6 750 square foot apartments in 4,500 square feet. The building doesn't look atrociously large by comparison to everything else in the neighborhood, and you've got 6 much more affordable units than if somebody thought we're going to build 6 units of 1,500 square feet per.
Can you look at page 29? So these are the actual,
Just 2.9?
yes, 2-9. So if we say, let's say 2-7, so this is RA, and I guess this is the one to the right, upper right, is kind of the max build out with the density bonuses, I think. Yeah. So, I don't know, for me, I look at that and I say, well, if you want to talk about house scale, that looks like house scale to me. I mean, it's, you know, the notion of walking along a street and what sort of, you know, the sense you get of it is that it's a house. The same if you go over to RB, which is on page 2-9. And then I guess RC, which is 2-11. At that point, I can see, you know, perhaps what you're talking about, Lloyd, that it's not, you know, house sized or house scale. But I think there's not going to be many of those that are built, and I do think it's still a good point that Michael's made about, and that James made about, you're looking for infill development, that as you walk down the street, you'll have, you know, existing housing, and then this is in the middle, so to speak. And it's crafted and built in such a way with the design details that it doesn't look like an apartment block out of East Berlin or something.
Not that brutalism is bad.
Yeah.
Right. Not that it's bad, but there's some places we don't want it. So I guess I'm just trying to get a sense, you know, looking at these, and it sounds like what you're talking about, Lloyd, is a different model. Maybe what we've adopted here is really based off the form of the building as opposed to square footage based,
And-
correct?
Well, RA looks doable, but RB and RC, these upper right-hand ones, they look rather large to fit on a lot.
Well,
But I know that those are different neighborhoods. I mean, I get
Yeah.
it, but
and not to confuse the conversation too much, because this may really relate to the rate of change analysis and displacement work sessions more, but I do want to just call us back to the study mentioned at the beginning, not that it's the final word on it, but it showed allowing units, 6 to 10 units on lots through a majority of the city was the mechanism they found actually made a difference in affordability. It also found that buildings with steel or concrete construction, which in our market, as my understanding, that's above 5, are not more affordable. It says explicitly that construction material is much more expensive per square foot. That alone would eliminate most of the savings from lower land costs. So I just want to call us back to the fact that the only mechanism by which we could get that is RB and RC. So if you're talking about removing that because you think that it doesn't look enough like a house, you're removing a very specific type of housing product that is the only one meeting that missing middle demand. I don't support that. That is a policy decision we could make. I just want to call us back to the fact that if we're saying it doesn't look like enough like a house, we want to get rid of it, that it will be the implication of that policy choice.
And I totally get that. And so that's part of what I'm, at a loss. I realized that they were difficult times when y'all were trying to work through the future land use map. But somehow they ended up, the map that we have is one that had significant medium intensity residential.
But not by any concentrated effort by council. Because
Okay.
council didn't spend any time on it.
Okay.
I just want to add one other thing, just on the market side, and I credit to Commissioner Stolzenberg, who I think wrote very well on this topic. There's kind of a market differentiation that we're looking at too between the corridors and what happens in an RX or CX or an NX district, where I think we're going to see smaller unit apartments, products that are aimed at young professionals, singles, and so on, whereas the target market for these buildings that are going to be in residential neighborhoods is going to be much more oriented towards families,
Yes.
because those are the folks that are going to pick that location, generally speaking.
Yeah. So I think to Michael's point, the house sized, I wonder if it's kind of a stand-in for the question of, do we want to have medium intensity residential? Because I don't think with to get the sort of products that, and I agree, I think we are going to have to build products like what's in RC to get the result that we want. But then, what that means is that we are going to have these large, significant sections of our community where people don't like that, and it's not going to look house-sized to some people, and it will certainly be, it's controversial. I get it. So I'm just trying to wonder if it's the question, and I'm not assuming any disingenuousness. Please don't take that at all. I'm just wondering, is it the question of house size as an idea, or is it the notion of the medium intensity residential as a problem, or is it both?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I look at the pictures on 2.9 and 2.11 in the upper right-hand corner of both and think, as I'm trying to think, for just to use one example, the area around Rugby Avenue and Rose Hill Drive. And that contemplates, I think it was RC along both sides of Rugby Avenue within a couple of lots worth of the corner, and then RB beyond that. And I'm thinking, if what we expect, if what we want is to have RC on each side of that corner and RB extended down beyond that, that strikes me as a very, very significantly different neighborhood from A, what we've got now, and B, what we reasonably ought to be thinking about for there. I look at RB and at those diagrams, and I think I don't know why those aren't now into the category of the RXs and so on, because that looks just so much more dense.
And so I guess, right, and one question I have is, do you, Lloyd, agree with, the notion that Rory has put forward, and that at least Michael and I think agree with, that for us to get the end result that we need, we're going to need some sort of product like this? Or are you waiting until we get the rate of change and trying to back into it somehow from that? Or?
Well, I'd really like to see the rate of change analysis, but the other piece to it is, and you got to remember that what we're talking about is not only this degree of density, but at least to some extent, we're legitimizing commercial uses and so on in these places. And I keep going back to just the example that I spent the most time on is, the neighborhood around Oxford and Sherwood and Harrow and so on. And those houses that are fairly small next to each other, lots fairly small. Yes, it happens to be next to Greenleaf Park, and yes, that's a good thing. But we're talking about this kind of density, and we're talking about the possibility of commercial uses, And if we're serious about having more residential uses there, then we shouldn't be having commercial uses. And I think the neighborhood there is legitimately concerned as they look at this kind of diagram and they see that that's what we're projecting for their street as something we presumably want them to have, which they clearly don't want to have. And, so I know we can't force them to have anything, but do we want to create a neighborhood, do we want to create the potential for a neighborhood that we can be reasonably certain at that degree of density we're going to regret having created?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I do think there are certain, so you're talking about Plymouth Road?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I met with those folks as well. I think that they have been able to make like very concrete, specific arguments about why the overlay there isn't appropriate. And I think maybe even, James, that particular area, the streets that work typology maybe ran amok a little bit. I think if you followed it to the exact logical consistency, their area would get what it's getting, but something seems amok there because,
Yeah.
but I guess just backing up, obviously we're trying to take care and look out for the people that own homes here now, but we're also trying to fundamentally change the sort of operating envelope of what we can build in the city so that other people who don't have what they have will have the opportunity to have it.
Yeah, so just let me chime in here, because I had several thoughts. So, in my mind, one of the main reasons that I think that we need to do this is, and that's in different discussion, is to address, deep affordable housing. And so, but Leah and I can attest to this, being on this school board for 16 years, is that there's a lack of that middle income, that missing middle that we talked about, and teachers just could not afford, and that's what I see in RB and in RC, that we need that as well, but we also need, and so we need this housing types and quantity in all parts of the city, because I think in the past it's only been in certain ones, and we want to kind of spread the love. And I think that we're going to have to make some difficult choices, as council, where it take place. But I think that now we're it's 10 square miles. We can look at, certain streets like Plymouth and say, that doesn't seem right, or it may be others as well. But I think that when I look at this, RB is like, okay, it's kind of on the edge, but if it's designed right, all this design is really important in this. I think that, the example that she showed, Chrissy showed, and I know that that's not exactly like this, but the big building, but in the middle it was like a break. This is not the same type, but if it's designed correctly, I think that it's something that can be doable. And RC, that just has to be in certain places that can accommodate that, and it just won't look too much out of scale. So.
But we won't have the ability to say, yeah, that's really ugly. You can't build that, it's ugly.
Well, we can't do that with a McMansion now.
No, we can't. But if the reason why it's okay is that it can be solved by good design, but we have no power to mandate good design, then that's an admission, it seems to me, that we're just exposing, we're basically going to say, who was it who said that we have to remember that the heart of the developer is mean and nasty, and I don't remember what it said. But I mean, if that's what we're dealing with, let's not assume all kinds of benign thoughts on the part of the developer.
But there are a lot of standards in here to sort of keep them in check. Sorry, go ahead.
And I would definitely agree with that in terms of I don't assume the market is the market. I don't assume it's like the wind. I don't assume good faith or whatever. But I think part of it too is, if you're evaluating, like, let's say some of the roads you mentioned that are small, older homes, it's also completely feasible that under the current zoning, within 30 years, developers could buy up every single one of those homes, knock them down, build a McMansion that is a huge square footage, and the feel and physical design of the neighborhood would have been transformed but you haven't opened up any new housing options in the city. So I'm just saying that to say that even without these changes, like some substantial change is not only allowed, but is probably inevitable on a certain time horizon. And I think some of those homes that could get built, the square footage wouldn't even be that different than RB or RC.
Could I ask one question? Yeah, completely makes sense. Could I ask a question? So Lloyd was basically sort of trying to get at this, I think, from a square footage perspective. Like, what's a reasonable amount of square footage for, you know, family to live in? And then how does, so if you back into this whole conversation from a square footage perspective, you would end up, I think, in a different place in terms of, you know, what you'd end up being able to build. I guess this is more like a, let's put some fences around it, so to speak, in terms of height and width and the things that she had added up there, and
Yeah.
let the market figure out what's the best square footage to build.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a certain amount of that. We're creating an envelope, and I'll let Christy speak to that. I think she has a number of good points that she can make in there. There was a prior conversation where one of the things we added was footprint, which wasn't there previously. And I do want to highlight the point that Councilor Payne is making, because I do think it's an important one, particularly when I think about where I've been in the past. It's important to consider not only comparing what's proposed to what's here now, but what's proposed to what you can do today under the zoning ordinance. The fact of the matter is, under our zoning ordinance, there's very few limits on what someone can build in terms of the scale and size of a single-family house.
Mm-hmm.
They can be very, very large. They can be, and if you go to Arlington, where I'm from, if you go up to where I previously worked in Massachusetts, that is what is happening today, barring that Arlington just passed an ordinance doing what we're looking at. But up until they passed that, they're seeing tear downs and seeing 8,000 square foot single-family houses being built within the boundaries of their existing zoning ordinance, readily allowed within the context of our zoning ordinance. And that was clearly what I was seeing in suburban Boston as well.
Interesting.
So it's just noting, making sure the comparison to what we have today is important, but also important to acknowledge the comparison between what we're proposing here and what our current ordinance does allow.
Right.
And it grants considerable rights to single family.
Well, I think it's also important on that note to distinguish between the Ego project, the guy who builds the 8,000 square foot McMansion as a matter of ego, and we like to vilify developers, but developers at least are constrained by some rules of economics, and they're much less likely to build something like that because it doesn't sell well.
Well, in those markets I was referring to, that's the standard build that developers are building.
Well.
But but I want to let Christy speak to some of these particular
Okay.
issues, if we can give her a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, I think a key to this discussion really is building width. You know, as I mentioned in one of those previous slides, height, width, this building footprint we've added, and building coverage, those really do work together to result in what an allowable developable square footage would be. But as far as what is perceptive from the street and what determines that house-sized feel, really that height and in particular that width, which is something you don't have in your ordinance today, it is absolutely critical to that house size perception. And one thing I do want to point out, and I think it's a good example of how that those courtyard examples I showed and building width, how those work together to get better design outcomes. So when we require that building width, we provide in the rules. So if you're looking at page 2-8, for example, and you see in massing, if you're looking at this digitally, by the way, you can just click on that section 2.10.10. That takes you to the rules for building width. In those rules, so if you click on that, or if you analog flip the page to 2-129, what we build in there is an allowance for an open space exception. And so it restricts the building width, but it says if you build a courtyard that has very specific standards, that those courtyard examples that I showed would meet, then you can basically have a continuous building, but it feels a lot smaller from the street and you get that open space. So I think it's a good example of why building width is in particular very critical, and it ties to those good design outcomes, and it's pre-coded into these rules.
That makes sense, thank you.
And 1,200 square feet is not as small as you think. Last week, I had the opportunity to go to the 2 newly built Habitat homes in the city on Coleman. Well, first of all, there are places in the city, I don't even know where they are, but my GPS got me there. But the 2 townhouses are 1,200 square feet, and there are families moving in them. There are 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and they have a lower level that's unfinished, a basement, lower level, whatever you want to call it. So that's unfinished. But upstairs, there's the living dining area and the kitchen. It's all open space. There is another room that could be classified as a bedroom because it has a closet and a window. But when they told me 1,200 square feet, I'm like, oh, okay. And I went in and it was 1,200 square feet, but it was enough space for a family. And one of the families has 3 children, I believe they told me. Both of the families, I think, have 3 children. And so, but it's plenty of space. And yes, they are townhouses, but they fit the lot and all of those, you know, they've met all of the whatevers. But I didn't realize that it was a lot larger than I thought once I got in.
Yeah.
And so when you hear Lloyd talk about his son in the 1,000 square feet, you could see that.
Yeah.
You know, and there are a lot of neighborhoods where you could see those 2 units on a lot, and they're not obtrusive. And most of the houses that I saw going up, because it is a cul-de-sac, are single family, except for one of them, I think. Well, maybe 1 or 2 of them might be like a house, but it's like, you know, a rental unit here and a rental unit there. But it all blends. And so if we're talking about something that is aesthetically pleasing, because you could have put 1 house on that lot and you would have had 1 family, but now you have 2 houses on that lot, so you have 2 families.
And it occurred to me, by the way, that one of the things about the place where my son lives is that it's a classic example, I believe, of the stacked townhouse notion. He's got 2 townhouses at ground level, 2 townhouses above that. That building, because different district, actually has 3, 2, 2, 2. And at that point, it's a 6,000 square foot building, and that, but you could easily have a 4,000 square foot building with 4 very nice residences in it, in a building that would not look significantly different from a regular house.
Well, and on that point, I definitely agree. I think stacked townhomes are positive and good to encourage.
I don't know. I
10,
think,
10.
James helped me here, but I think that the path that this has taken for a long time is basically to let decisions, we do have the minimum, we have the lot coverage piece, but it's a form-based type code where the controlling parameters are things like width, height, not dictating how many square feet per unit or something per
Well,
residence.
Right, but one example I'll use, I mentioned this last night. Right now, our current ordinance basically defines the size of building you can get by setbacks, right? And that can be huge. This one, setbacks just define where the placement of the building is. But then these other rules, width, footprint, overall lot coverage, those come in and actually define the scale of the building itself. Chris, can you talk a little bit about the footprint standard in particular and how we arrived at that? Is that something we can do?
She'll be right back.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Turn my video back on. So with the building footprint, and it calibrates up a bit. So by 500 square feet, if you flip between RA, RB, and RC, and that really is to get at, we are allowing a bit more width as we incrementally go up and a bit more height as we incrementally go up, because we're assuming that there could be more units in those buildings. But really we looked at what would be a reasonable square footage size if someone decided to build out to the maximum allowed number of base units. So it is a bit flexible, I would say, but it is something that we looked at across a lot of different building typologies. The reason we want to make it flexible is because footprint changes based on if in RA, for example, you have a side-by-side duplex versus a stacked duplex. It's still 2 units, but the footprint of it changes some. And there are also implications for what type of product that tends to be. So if you think of something that's side-by-side where all units touch the ground, whether it's either side-by-side or sort of deep in a lot, those tend to be fee simple or home ownership, because you can have the land associated with it. Anytime something becomes stacked and has a lower footprint associated with it, those tend to be rental or condos, which condos are just really expensive and challenging to finance. So by giving a bit more flexible of a building footprint, it also tends to encourage more home ownership type building types, if that makes sense.
So I'm just wondering, this seems like a really big sort of stone in the creek here in terms of philosophically how we feel about medium intensity residential, and I'm for it. I'm for it, and I'd be willing to countenance things like maybe we dial back the percentages of the geographic spread, or maybe we come up with some way of rationing permits, which I don't think, Mr. City Attorney, is going to work.
So,
Or maybe we, maybe we go back to this notion of this being a 5-year document where we say this is where we are, what we're saying for now, but then we revisit it in a few years. But it seems to me we need to figure out which way we're going around this topic.
not to sidetrack us too much, but I think it directly relates to this conversation. Why was Arlington able to do what they did, but we couldn't, in terms of the limit on the amount? They had an annual limit on the amount of medium.
Hasn't been tested in court yet.
Arlington County was sued immediately after the adoption, and so I guess the short answer is it kind of depends on the status of that litigation. I would be happy to review the pleadings in that lawsuit and provide a response on what the extent to which the legal challenge encompasses the rationing piece. But my recollection is that the rationing, the limits are a part of that litigation that are being contested right now. But I do need to go back and research that and make sure I'm giving you a good answer.
But they could lose or prevail. It's just like a gray area for us, I guess.
That's correct. That's correct. And the outcome of the Arlington litigation will in some ways be informative. I think I need to be candid with you. Litigation grinds on, and we're not going to have that answer, certainly not within the next several months, and potentially significantly longer.
Tired of getting sued.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. And to answer your question, I mean, as I've said, I think the RB and RC are positive, and the only way we're getting a very specific type of housing product that is going to be central to ensuring we have any kind of middle class and upward mobility within our city. my big concern if we remove it or significantly limit it is with our affordable housing investments, we'll have housing for very low-income people and very rich people, and we're going to have no middle class or economic mobility, and I don't think that's the future we want. That's why I think it's really important. I do think it is still house and neighborhood scale. Depending on what the specifics of it are, I could be open to thinking about. I was most interested in the Arlington model, which sounds like it has significant uncertainties. But if there's something similar, I'm potentially open to it. The biggest thing with RB and RC that I see as a need is on a very specific lot level, some lots that I think there is either a displacement risk or perhaps it was just kind of arbitrarily included. Oh, well, it wasn't arbitrarily included, but if you look at if you walked the neighborhood, it would feel somewhat arbitrary. But to my mind, my concern is on a very specific lot level and not something that comes down to, say, only put it on a corner lot or just blanket cut it by 50%. I think that would be a policy mistake. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I'm supportive of it as well, but I think that's why we're having this, that we can talk with, Lloyd and Leah and among us to see, what that would look like, just like we just kind of did with the special use permits for commercial type of things.
I had said earlier, I wasn't quite sure about the source. I'm realizing now as I look at RA, RB, RC, that looking at page 2-6 and 2-7, I see that there would be apparently no restriction that would keep from having a 9,000 square foot building in an RA zone as long as you had more than 2 units. That's a ridiculously large building. It'd be 10,500 square feet in an RB zone. That's a ridiculously large building. And even if you divide it out by the number of apartments that would be permissible, whether it's going to be 4 or 6 or whatever the bonuses would equate to, that all assumes you could get to that point if you had every single unit in there being 1,500 or 1,600 square
So
feet.
you're multiplying the building footprint max by
Times number of floors.
Where are you? Hold on.
Look at 2-6,
Yep, I'm on 2.
3,000 square feet to 2-7, more than 2 units, 3 floors. That's 9,000 square feet. I mean, that's triple the size of, certainly my house. It's more than triple the size of my house.
Yeah, 9,000 is triple both of ours, isn't it?
So, I just think there ought to be a way to deal with that problem. And if we have created an ordinance that allows a 9,000 square foot building to be built there, we ought to figure out a way to make sure that doesn't happen. The other piece I would say is I have suggested at one point that we try to acknowledge the fact that even by tripling our capacity, which is what we're proposing to do, we will create a whole lot more opportunities.
in the RA.
Even if we make RA the standard across
But-
the city, we've now tripled the number of opportunities.
It should be noted, I think with RB and RC, again, it's a very specific housing product. Minneapolis allowed triplexes across the entire city. I think to date, they've only seen 70 built, and I don't know their population, but it's obviously much, much larger than ours. So in theory, there's a number of units, but it's going to be a different product, and the market is not going to respond to that in the way it does in RB and RC.
I understand. And so if we look at it then, say we're going to have RB, but we're not, or however you want to call it. I mean, I personally would be in favor of some sort of RA, RB designation that expressly eliminates commercial uses, and that would allow for some greater degree of protection for the places like Plymouth and so on. But supposing we said we're gonna, as I suggested before, supposing we allow RB and/or RC on corner lots, or something like that, where we have some greater degree of opportunity there. I just look at the notion of, as I see on page 211, it looks like they're proposing to have 2 RC lots side by side, and what is being proposed for those 2 lots, are 2 RC lots side by side, I just don't think is compatible with an awful lot of what we're doing in the city. The other broad thing I wanted to say, and Brian touched on this a minute ago, we have an extraordinarily ambitious statement of an overall goal. The overall goal that is stated of the walkable city is a walkable neighborhood environment intended to accommodate a variety of housing options, including single-unit homes, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, and small apartments in general residential and medium-intensity residential areas designated in the comprehensive plan, supporting and within walking distance of neighborhoods serving retail, food, and service uses. This is essentially the same goal that was set out for Paris, the city of Paris, France, which has 15 times the density that we've got. The least dense neighborhood in Paris is 4 times more dense than the most dense area in Charlottesville. It may well be that in the year 2050, this is an attainable goal. To say that we're going to make that our goal in 2023, and that this is the path that we're going to take because we believe it's going to get us there, I think, number one, assumes a clearer crystal ball than we possess. And number two, means that we are sort of putting ourselves or committing ourselves to a course that I think we're clearly going to revisit it every 5 or 10 years anyway. And so the question is, do we need to create an ordinance right now that we think gets us to the year 2050? Or do we want to create an ordinance that gets us on that path with the expectation that 5 years from now, we'll look at it again? And maybe 5 years from now, we see that certain trends have occurred, certain things have happened. In the meantime, we hopefully will have taken a step in the right direction. And so my thought on it all has been that to create and to state that it is our goal in the present zoning ordinance, in our terms right now, to create the walkable neighborhood environment is simply an unrealistic goal. And I think that to say it that way, and to say it that simply and clearly, I mean, I applaud the clarity of the vision. I just don't think that it's a realistic vision to have right now, and people are going to look at us and say, "You're nuts. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen certainly within the next 5 years." And we all acknowledge, I think, it's not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. We're not going to get to the kind of density that would support a walkable neighborhood for many, 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 many years.
But it sounds a little bit like you're saying we're not going to get there, but one reason one might say we're not going to get there is if we don't do some of these things that will let us get there. I mean,
Yeah.
look, Paris got to where it got through, I'm sure, lots of, tenement housing, all kinds of terrible stuff that we wouldn't go in for now, but the end result is one that we like, but, the transitional states, I'm sure, were not pleasant. And I'm not saying we're going to end up with something that's,
So,
tenement housing, but.
Lord, if we had your druthers, what would you have us? What would you?
I would say that we do RA, basically everybody, we do the tripling of the capacity, that we create some places that allow for additional density. If you want to look at RC as the model, that's fine. That we that we do that in perhaps on corner lots, and that's our way to sort of ration things in a way that is consistent with land use considerations, not just market considerations. And then we see what happens. Now, I have to say, I have not seen the detailed analysis of the rate of expected change. I was hoping that that would be something we were taking up earlier, but it may be that, you know, circumstances didn't permit that, that's fine. I completely agree with the notion that, and I've heard both Councilor Purrier and actually, I guess maybe all four of you say that there's no point in going through all this and not solving a problem. But I'm also concerned about, quite frankly, that if there is enough of a sort of a political backlash, that 2 years from now or 4 years from now, we may end up with a council that regrets the decision that this council has made. And so that's one of the reasons I want to take things somewhat more slowly, with the expectation that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll say, you know, it hasn't been the end of the world. Yeah, we can keep going in this direction.
So when you said a little bit slower, what about the UCLA study where they said that, you know, if you do it incremental, that's going to impact households, owners now?
Well, I haven't read the study, but I gather that just from the language of it, that what they were talking about most specifically, again, to use my three-dimensional metaphor, was the two-dimensional piece of it. And I'll have to look at it and see whether they were, what they were saying about the intensity piece as well.
They define it as 6 to 10, so basically RB and RC are more content.
So, and I really want to see what the rate of expected change analysis is going to tell us. But I have no idea. Let's see what they say.
Yeah, I mean,
One more time.
It sounds as if, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, is that if things that are in this book with the necessary tweaks happen, you feel, Lloyd, and if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong, that we're just on a path to nowhere and it's irrevocable and there's no way to ever change it. And maybe I'm misinterpreting it, because that's what I heard you say at first. But then I heard you say, but if we do RA and RB, that will show the public that we are doing something, and it's incremental, and over time, the missing middle will happen. Or are you saying both? Or am I completely off?
Well, what I'm saying is that I think we need to recognize that the one thing that I think everybody on council has agreed with, to allow 3 units per lot, is already going to put us among the more liberal places in the country in this respect.
Okay.
Acknowledge that, see what happens with that.
Okay.
My guess is that there will be some significant amount of use of that option. But again, I haven't seen the economic analysis in detail to know. I also think, by the way, that, you know, and I say this to some of my friends who yell at me the most on the Greenbrier listserv, that they're not that the Greenbrier neighborhood isn't likely to get this kind of use pattern in any event. So none of this, whether it's RA, RB, RC, is likely to affect the neighborhoods that are now most exclusionary, if you want to use that term. So to the extent that this is being seen as righting past wrongs, racial inequities and so on, I don't think it's very likely to happen.
Okay.
To me, the issue and the reason for doing this has really been much more the missing middle conversation and having places for the teachers and firefighters and police officers to live and that kind of thing. Whether that's going to happen in Greenbrier or Rugby or wherever, I couldn't tell you. I don't know where it actually, well, I don't know. I just don't know where it'll happen. I shouldn't try to predict because I can't. My overall concern is that what we're arguing about most is stuff that isn't likely to happen anyway, and that we are creating political hot buttons
Okay,
that that we shouldn't be creating.
okay,
And that if we create political hot buttons and we energize an opposition to this entire scheme,
Yeah.
we will regret having done so.
I see what you're saying.
And so one of the advantages of sort of going one step at a time, you're going to think about it in terms of a 5-year plan. We do the comp plan every 5 years. We look at it after 5 years and say, hasn't been working, okay? Now we get back to the metaphor of turning up the radio dials. We tweak that a little bit. We say, okay, what can we do more that's going to help with that? And that's why, you know, again, the two metaphors that stuck with me through this entire process
Okay.
were the house-sized buildings and the tweaking of the radio dials. And that we can turn the radio dials up to greater intensity more readily than we can scale them back because
Okay.
of the likelihood that somebody would fight about their rights having been denied or whatever. And I just think that tends to argue for taking steps that, first of all, in theory, should work, should be significantly more liberalizing. And second, in practical terms, may well have that result, but that in any event, they will not do any violence to the long run.
Gotcha.
And if we do that and do it in a gradual manner, that we will be less likely to have people getting all horrified about things that aren't going to happen anyway.
Okay.
And we're more likely to end up with a good result, both economically and housing and politically and every other way.
So
So I-
so let me ask a question. Our little document right here, before the tweets, right as it is right now. How many new residences do you perceive that we will get? Just a guess. It doesn't have to be exact.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer that one right off the top of my head.
Okay.
That is what we did the rate of change analysis for.
Okay, and that'll
Looking
tell us.
purely at the RA, B, and C.
And that will tell us.
It gives you a sense. It gives you a sense of scale. I'm
Right.
going to say straight up, there are a lot of variables that come into play
That's
with any
what I'm thinking.
development, right?
Right.
I mean, we've already talked about the competitive, the market base, the competition between lots. We've got all the physical characteristics.
Okay.
You've got just the degree of which any lot comes up for sale in a given
Okay.
year. So there's a lot of variables, and I'm going to defer to that presentation. And
Okay.
we did intend for that to be the first, but unfortunately, availability was not.
Right. So can I ask you one
There.
question about rate of change,
Yep.
what you just said?
Yep.
Because that seems to be what's gonna get us to wherever we need to be. Will the rate of change give us an indices as to, dollar amounts, purchase prices between 3 and 500,000, between 2 and 450,000? I mean, do we have something, is there something out there that will say, and it doesn't have to be exact, and let me tell you why I'm thinking that. I hear Lloyd talking about the teachers and the fire personnel and the police personnel living in our city, okay? And there is a major metropolitan area that is not far from us that I have worked with, and we'll go into that another day. But the city purchased a building, which I don't think we have here, a building that size. But nonetheless, they purchased this building, and in the building is a school an elementary, pre-K to whatever elementary stops, but on this side. And on the other side are apartments for city personnel that are affordable. They're apartments. They're not condos or townhouses or anything. So that the fire personnel can live, the police personnel and the teachers, if they so desire to be there, they can afford it. And we keep saying that we're talking about middle-class families being able to afford to live. So I'm saying we're talking about purchasing, but is there something in your rate of change that's gonna say this is affordable? Because that's what I hear us talking about, and then there's a difference when we talk about affordable. I understand that, America. But what I'm talking about is affordability for middle-class people, because you're saying that in Charlottesville, there are none. And Juan and I can count the numbers of them that look like us on our two hands, can't we, Juan?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
All right,
So,
Can I just answer the question real quick?
yes, please.
So
Thank
the
you.
report doesn't specify that, but I can talk to the author of the report to see if that's something that's within their,
In their
because
scope, in
they
their
certainly,
wheelhouse.
yeah, in their wheelhouse to produce, because they produced a model to arrive at that rate of change,
Okay.
and that information may be embedded within that model.
Right, because if we do
So-
all of this and we don't get any middle-class housing, what have you done?
exactly. So just a couple of things with due respect, and I mean that with all sincerity, Lloyd. A couple of things. I think the rate of change analysis is a worthwhile endeavor for us to go through. My sense of whether that's going to give us some sort of like true clarity is no, it won't. I think the point that Michael made in his email is basically if we can do anything to like 1% increase. I mean, to me, the way I look at it is the real estate market. I mean, you cannot buy a house. Almost up and down, people are bidding each other out.
Yeah, even if you have the money.
Yeah, and so the one way to look at this is the rate of change, and I get that as an engineer. Those things make me feel happy inside. But but the
And
other
we,
I'm so
and we all
glad.
need to feel happy about
But-
at this point.
But the other
Right.
way to look at it is we are stuck, and
Mm-hmm.
we are going to remain stuck.
Mhm.
And the only way anyone has come up with to help us get unstuck is we're making major investments in affordable housing,
Yes,
which will help the people,
yes,
the part of America that you were just speaking
yes,
to.
the $10 million.
Yeah, and we'll
Yes.
continue to do that. We're
Yes.
supporting CRHA, we're being thoughtful, proactive. I don't,
We're doing all those things.
in fact, yeah. But if you talked about the political piece, and I appreciate that. A couple of things that I will say about that. When I ran, I was very clear on my website. Of course, there weren't that many people to choose from at the time. It was just me and Juan and one other person in the primary, but I was very clear, get the comp plan done and do the zoning ordinance. And maybe I wasn't following things as closely as I should have, but it was very clear in all the feedback that I heard from former Councilor Hill and everyone else. The medium intensity residential was this huge flashpoint. People were upset about it from both sides, but that was sort of a linchpin. And so I've already made it clear politically how I stand on that topic. I will say too, we have a new counselor likely to take office in January. This individual ran even more than I would in terms of density. The other thing that I just really, and I get it, our homes, for those of us who own homes, they are our primary source of investment, to be able to fund our kids' college or whatever. But most of the people that live in the city are renters, and I think we have one person on council who's a renter. And so in terms of the political backlash, yeah, I think there will be people that are going to be mad. They're already stomping mad. But I think there will be, for just looking in terms of political backlash, this whole thing got started, I think, by a planning commission meeting 3 or 4 years ago when someone came in with a banner and shut the whole thing down because there wasn't enough housing. And so I think that political piece cuts both ways. And I also think that homeowners, understandably, are going to be more vocal and have more time to tell us how mad they are. And I do fundamentally believe this. I do not think that even though we're tripling the possibility of density in RA zones, that that's going to turn into a product that anyone's going to want to build to the scale that we need. And I also think that the kind of product that you're going to get with the RB and RC is going to help families, middle-class families, much more than anything else. And so I'm not sure where we go. I appreciate the fact that the people on Rugby Avenue are unhappy. Maybe there's some things we can do about the lot size division. Maybe there are things we can tweak about that. But, and the other thing, even setting a 5-year plan, I think that 5-year plan would need to be very clear that we are planning to build units like this before I could get behind it. And then, anyway, I'm rambling at this point, but
No, you're not. You're being very clear. We got you.
it's, the community's come a long, long way and on this goal, and I really think that giving up on a sort of ambitious, maybe this is too ambitious, but an ambitious notion of what medium-intensity residential could look like would be a mistake.
And I agree with that, and for the subject of tonight's conversation, I continue to think RB, RC are at neighborhood residential scale. And, I fear as well, there was a fear brought up about, you could have, let's see, there RB, RC, every lot is converted to that maximum build out. I mean, I fear if you didn't change anything 30 years from now, or 10, 15 years from now, they'd all be torn down, large McMansions, or maybe not even McMansion, but just tear down something expensive. And we've just restricted our ability to have more people have the opportunity to live near a park or live in a neighborhood where they can kind of settle down there and get to know neighbors. And I think it's never going to be easy. I just think at some point we have to decide whether missing middle is in it or not, and it's never going to be easy. The Arlington model, I thought, was the best way to kind of square the circle. I think if you're talking about limiting it to corner lots, to me, it just seems, in terms of just pure policy decision, arbitrary and limiting it by too much. I thought the Arlington model was a way to kind of, the rate of change seems that it's likely the turnover is not going to be that much, but that would be a way to kind of guarantee it for people who have a concern that every single lot on a block will completely switch over. So that's where I'm at, and I think, and I've said this before, in my mind, the irony, I think the biggest changes that I think we're going to regret potentially the most are in these mixed-use corridors where you are talking about going to 8, 10, 12 stories next to single-family neighborhoods that, in my mind, is actually a dramatic change, not only in the built form and human scale, but also the type of construction material cost and business that may change there. That, to me, is my real concern when it comes to human scale, built design form. And I guess that's a philosophical thing that I appreciate someone can reasonably disagree with me. I just see RB and RC as human scale, but
You see it being too big?
I see RB and RC as being human scale and not too big.
Oh,
I think
okay.
it-
But
Yeah,
what
and
what did you say you thought would be too
The
big?
CX corridor.
Oh,
CX
the
and X.
Okay, I heard C and didn't hear the X.
So,
Yes, well, that, corner lots could be discriminatory. I have a corner lot.
So I guess, does anybody else share my concern that we should not be allowing a 9,000 square foot building in an RA zone or a 10,500 square foot building in an RB zone? Or am I just the only one?
Well, listen, I'm not a mathematician, and I keep looking at these numbers, so could you
I guess
explain that to me?
I'd be interested in thinking about it more. My first reaction, which is not necessarily my final one, is I don't necessarily see the difference in terms of neighborhood human scale between a 3,000 square foot building that's one story, and then if it was 3 and it's technically 9,000 square feet. I really
Oh, I see.
feel like it's the
3.
width and height that is going to determine how it feels to you. But that's just my initial reaction.
Well, I mean, so should we be allowing a 3,000 square foot footprint in RA?
But don't you already have some in RA that are 3,000 square feet, they're just single family?
Well, I mean, but they're not one-story buildings typically. A
Were you gonna say
3,000 square
something,
foot
Jamie?
building is typically gonna be two or 3 stories.
Okay, I'm with you now, I got it, thank you.
I think the difficult thing about all of this is, you know, and that's what the rate of change analysis is about, is trying to predict what the market's gonna do in the future with these different types of housing products. If someone could tell me, yeah, you build all these and they'll be filled with folks who have, you know, good jobs, middle-class jobs, you know, I wouldn't care about the size. If what's gonna happen is people are gonna come in and just, you know, build, you know, huge houses like on Locust Avenue or whatever, I would say that that's a waste. But I'm hoping that what will happen with this is that developers in the market will find this sweet spot where you will have, you know, stacked on top of each. And again, it's a max. I mean, I guess your point, Lloyd, is that the developer's always gonna build to the max, but
No, my point is that we need to recognize the potential problem that they might. And therefore, if there's a way to mitigate that risk, let's mitigate it up front rather than cuss about it after it happened.
yeah, I appreciate that. But
So what you're saying to make it 7? What, you know?
Well, I mean,
it's hard to tell.
I personally would say for RA, supposing we said 4,500 square feet, gross floor area. And for RB, say, you know, 6,000 square feet, or, you know, whatever. I mean, I guess the question, and I don't really know what the concept is about the affordable dwelling unit bonus. I'd have to think a little bit more about what the current manifestation of that is. I gather, I think I am correct, that we were eliminating the notion that all of them, that you could build 6 units and lose money on all 6 of them. What's the current, explain the current affordable dwelling unit bonus.
The current bonus in there is the additional units, the increment of new units have to be affordable at 60% of AMI. So if you go to the item number 2 on the left-hand page, and the bonus tells you how many units, the affordable housing bonus, and compare that to the base number, the increment of increase is what has to be affordable.
So, and this is actually a question I should have asked 6 months ago. When we're giving in RA, a 1-unit bonus for preserving the existing structure, does that have to be affordable if you're going to 6, or only the 2 additional units?
The bonus, so if you're claiming the bonus, that bonus for preserving the existing structure does not have to be affordable.
Okay, so you'd have, at that point, you would have potentially 4 and market rate and 2 affordable. And I take it the same thing applies in RB. Yeah. So you could have potentially in RB and RC, potentially 12 units. I mean, I just think that in RA, the notion of having 6 affordable units, or having 6 units, 2 of which or 3 of which may be designated as affordable.
Well, I would,
If you want that many, put them in 4,500 square feet. Those are 6 pretty decent-sized units by most people's standards. 750 square feet per.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm potentially open to a conversation like that. I mean, I don't feel able to commit to anything at this point because I genuinely don't know how to think through what, if any, implications there are in terms of how the market would respond. And maybe there's none, I don't know. But before I could commit to anything, I would need to just kind of think about it and look into it more.
So your notion, Lloyd, is if, let's just say 9,000 square foot for A, 10,500 would be 12,000 for C, is where we're looking at.
Where we are right now.
And your question is, is that either 10% higher or 25% higher than we think is reasonable, or are you saying, let's think if we can back into it from that
I
perspective?
think it's like 100% more than what I would think reasonable, at least in RA and RB.
Okay.
And is what what we were told earlier is one of the rationales for that greater flexibility in the building footprint was because it would allow for more homeownership types versus rentals. Was that correct?
It was, because the ownership is going to come into play where the units touch the ground, right? So a side-by-side duplex, for example. And that, a side-by-side duplex is necessarily going to have a larger footprint than something that stacks.
So if you're going to allow that degree of flexibility on the footprint, I think there needs to be something that limits the size of the building. And, multiplying 3,000 square feet by 3 floors, that gets us to a building that I think everybody would agree would be out of place. And would also get you, if you're doing 6 units, you'd have 6 units at 1,500 square feet each, which is, you're not going to be able to build, to think that those would be affordable in any meaningful way, I think is illusory. We also get to the question on affordable dwelling units of, are we saying that the city is going to subsidize them? Or are we saying the market's going to have to take care of it?
I thought the whole notion of IZ was that we would not be subsidizing those.
This isn't, is this what we're talking about in terms of IZ?
I thought so. This is inclusionary.
I thought
No.
of IZ as coming into the larger buildings.
Let me put it this way, like, all of it is IZ. I think typically an IZ proposal is internally subsidized. I'm not sure that this scale of affordability with this number of units is financially feasible.
I think
So I think these would be subject to some form of, I think in order to build a project that has the number of affordable units proposed in here would probably require some form of subsidy
And I think,
outside of the internal, sorry.
or no, sorry. I mean, even our original conversation, I think, was to basically provide flexibility for affordable housing providers. I think you could see some Habitat could potentially build in terms of with their own sweat equity subsidy without a direct city subsidy, but whether it be city or otherwise, most would. But that was kind of that was known in the conversation. Quite frankly, I would be fine with saying you don't even have this affordable housing bonus, but you have some sort of special use or exception process, for an affordable housing provider. Maybe a rezoning is sufficient for that. I don't know. Because I think the real concern was, as just like a concrete example, you get like Park Street, you get a nonprofit that's able to acquire 1 or 2 lots, even under the rezoning. In order to make it work in terms of their LIHTC application, they'll need more than what exists by right. Do they have some flexibility to get a project done? And I don't think we want to remove that flexibility. But if that can be done via some sort of SUP or special exception project, I think that's sufficient without even a by right kind of double density affordable bonus, which the market on its own really, except for rare exceptions, wouldn't respond to without subsidy.
I mean, I would not be in favor of anything that gave a subsidy to, frankly, to a private individual or a private corporation.
And I don't think it's assuming any subsidy.
Yeah, I had certainly not read this as meaning that we're going to
Okay.
Yeah.
So
It just means it's theoretically
So,
flexible.
so as a practical matter, the bonuses only come into play if a PHA or a CRHA or a Habitat or somebody can figure out a way to
I think that's right.
rejigger the project to make that happen.
And if they're seeking a subsidy from the city, they would have to go through the normal city process
Yeah.
and compete as is normally set up. There's no, this is not implying any sort of automatically receiving their subsidy.
So Lloyd, is then your suggestion, then we're gonna, essentially, we should move these numbers back from, oh goodness, from 6 to 3 or 4 in terms of the number of units, and divide that into the 9,000 to get a sense of, you know, what would be.
Well, no, my sense of things is that what we ought to do is to have a provision someplace, and if we have to create a new category 7 on the last page of each section, we do so. It says, that basically puts a limit on the gross floor area, allowing the flexibility for the building footprint, however you want to redo it, whatever height you want, within the limits here, just as long as, but saying that having defined the envelope doesn't mean you get to build to the envelope.
Right. Okay. I think I need to think about this some more.
Yeah.
It's 8
Yeah.
o'clock.
And I'm conscious of the fact we've been here for 3 hours already. And there are
Hardly
other
feels like that.
And there's other information that we need to get before we nail down where we are on these.
And
I think it's been helpful, though.
And perhaps we just delay this conversation to a future work session, but I think a really important one is that built form and human scale of those mixed-use corridors.
I agree.
At some point, I understand why residential has gotten our focus, but we can't
Yeah.
just not discuss that.
Yeah,
I
it's
agree.
on my list.
We will
for
have
sure.
that discussion,
It's happening.
yes. Okay, it's 7:54. Is there any reason we shouldn't say, since we're only supposed to be here for 2 hours, any reason we shouldn't adjourn?
No.
Did you have anything else for us, James?
Well, I wanted a brief check-in. I mentioned the 2 upcoming topics for the 3rd and the 11th. Are there,
Sound good to me.
okay?
Other folks agree?
What could you
Displacement-
review?
Displacement would be the main topic next time, and then population growth, housing market, and rate of change analysis would be for the.
That is correct.
Yeah.
We have, for the displacement conversation, there have been recommendations from the HAC, the Housing Advisory Committee, on that. Is there an interest in having one of our speakers from that group?
This is the piece about whether to rent.
It's the
or-
displacement conversation, displacement and gentrification.
I don't have a problem with it unless you.
That's fine.
Yeah.
feel like
yeah.
Sure.
you can-
If
It
it's-
is an area that I haven't thought about as deeply as I have some other things, so I'm happy to have other inputs.
Would you think,
Well, do you feel like you can have that conversation just amongst the 5, or is there questions and/or context that you feel you need to engage in that conversation?
So, yeah, I think like today, a lot of things is kind of spurred off other people's comments or questions. If we do have someone, it can be like today or tonight where they kind of speak at the beginning and, you know, they don't have to be available the whole time if we meet 2 or 3 hours, but that's what I envision.
Speak at the beginning and then available for questions as necessary,
Yeah,
which is the
Determine.
model we did tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, and the actual thing they sent to us was pretty clear, I think.
yeah.
within those topics, does the mixed-use corridors fit into something to discuss, or would that be part of something
Well-
beyond even those next 2?
So those are the 3 meetings that we've defined. We have 3 more times
Yeah.
reserved that we suggested were going to be for drilling down into topics. So I'd suggest we use that to drill down.
Okay.
Well, I wonder too, if we're talking about anti-displacement, it connects.
It does.
It connects, I don't think that's the only part of it, but it definitely connects.
And
So-
that may be, has the planning commission come up with its own determination on that topic yet?
No, but it is in the queue.
Yeah, so it might make more sense for us to have that discussion
Later in
after we've
October.
got it from the planning commission.
The specific discussion that Mr.
Yeah.
Council Payne is referring to? Yeah.
You think?
Yeah, well, I thought, I need to go back and watch yesterday's, but before that, I thought they did make a decision that in some areas there would be like a special exception or use.
It was not a decision, it was a go forth and draft.
Okay,
And we're working on that, that's where we are now.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, first of all, Christy, thank you so much for your involvement. I'm sorry we held you for 3 hours.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
And anyway, appreciate your help. Thank you. And with that, folks, we're adjourned.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, okay.